Good morning, everyone. My name is Graham Lee. I'm the Chair and Trustee of CICRA. To my right here is Professor Nick Croft, who's also a Trustee. Just wanted to talk a little bit about the day and what we'll be doing. But a couple of things I just wanted to say first. I would like to say on behalf of CICRA, many thanks, especially to the Royal Society of Medicine for this fantastic venue that they have provided for us today. Also, the health professionals that are all here, they all give their time for free. It's absolutely fantastic that they come on a Saturday to be able to talk to everyone. We have a lot of volunteers here today, as you will see, hovering around, and also all of our supporters, donors and fundraisers. We really do rely on these people so much to make sure that we can continue with the charity. I just want to say a little bit about the day. As you know, we have, from your agenda, you'll see that there are a number of presentations. We will have a panel session towards the afternoon. However, for those with under 12s and possibly some over 12, as we find out, we have an entertainer downstairs. So if you go into the tea and coffee area and go down those stairs in the centre there is a room. We have an entertainer and a couple of volunteers who will be doing various magic tricks and entertainment, etc. And we also have a teenagers chat group for teenagers just to sit and chat. If anyone has been to any of our family days before, it's a very enjoyable time, I think, for those teenagers to possibly get away from all of the talks and also sometimes get away from their parents and just talk amongst people of the same age. We tend not to allow parents to go to that session. So the under 12s, the magic show and entertainment is on all throughout the entire day. So please do take your children down there. If they get bored in the middle of the sessions, do feel free to just pop down there and drop your child off and come back. Very informal. We try and keep this very informal. The 13 to 18-year-old teenagers group will be on from 2 o'clock till 3:30. So that's all I wanted to say initially. I just wanted to hand over the microphone to a very special person that we have with us today. We're very lucky to have our Life President, Professor John Walker-Smith, with us today. Professor Walker-Smith is, I think, I would say, and I'm a bit biased, that he is really the founding father of paediatric gastroenterology in the UK. And he was actually my doctor when I was diagnosed a long, long time ago. So it's fantastic that he's been able to come here today, and he just would like to say a couple of words.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here on this occasion. It's remarkable how CICRA has grown. I've been a Life President for 25 years. That seems surprising too to me in June of this year, although the foundation of CICRA was in 1978. And it was, of course, our chairman's mother, Mrs. Margaret Lee, together with a number of other parents who took the initiative. They were my patients with Crohn's disease, parents of my patients with Crohn's disease at Bart's Hospital. And they came to me about the need for research. I think it was a bit of a shock to quite a few people to realise that we didn't know the cause of Crohn's disease. And at that time, there were limited options for treatment. So they wisely thought that we should begin a campaign to raise money for a research team. And in fact, there was a laboratory at Bart's that they were going to support. So that was a very good beginning. But that's only one part of CICRA. The second part of CICRA, of course, here today, is the pastoral care, the kind of care that the National Health Service can't provide. This is the service for teaching children about the problem that they have, meeting the parents and socialising together, learning more about the disorder, and also providing a voice for children. And as we've heard today, this is an occasion for Voice for Children. We actually began at Bart's, the teenage group, a long time ago, Sister Lucas, on Saturday mornings, and that really was a great success, and look at how it's expanded. There's one other thing that has been an unexpected positive gain from CICRA, is CICRA right at the beginning saw not only would they fund research fellows, but they would agree that young research fellows needed training as well. So that the CICRA fellowships, and many of the doctors in this country who are paediatric gastroenterologists at one stage of their career were CICRA fellows. So CICRA has helped develop this new specialty. When I was a medical student and when I was a young doctor, paediatric gastroenterology didn't exist. Children, it wasn't very common to have Crohn's disease, but those children who did were treated by adult gastroenterologists, which was very unsatisfactory because paediatrics, of course, is the growing and developing human organism. So that the third thing that CICRA has done is to stimulate the development of our specialty. So it's going to be a great day, and I just wish you all the very best and enjoy today, and I hope that the feedback will be good from the children and child patients who are here today. It is actually a pleasure to have Graham is one of those patients you can't forget, but he is one of the great success stories that you can get better from Crohn's disease completely. So that does happen, and maybe that's a comfort to some of you at some point in your career. So thank you. And one other thing I should mention, Nick has recently written a very good review in, what's the name of your magazine? The Insider. Insider, yeah. And I thought that really you've documented in fact the achievements that CICRA has supported. And that's a very good thing to do. So it's very worthwhile. The elusive cause of Crohn's disease awaits for future research. But onward we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Nick Croft to start presenting the presenters, or introducing the presenters. If there are any children that do want to go now, Paige just here is going to take people down to the entertainer. So if there's anyone who wants to leave now, please do. Otherwise, as I say, we try to keep this quite informal. So if people do need to go out and about and drop them down or whatever, occasionally we get a couple of children that come back in between times. So do feel free to do that as well. You can obviously come down the front and go out. There's also a door just at the back up there as well that you can go from. And now I'll pass over to Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the RSM, this fantastic venue. I don't think there could be many venues where the fire evacuation place is a cocktail bar across the road. Anyway, so I'm just going to introduce people. I'm not doing any of the work, actually, and you're going to hear from various experts from mainly around London, but not all in London, and we will also be having a question and answer session. So save up those burning questions. We may allow one or two at the end of talks, depending a bit on timing. But do save up some questions for a session afterwards where we'll have all the expert panel who you can quiz about things, anything really, to do with the conditions. So our first speaker is Zach Green, who's a research fellow funded by CICRA. So this is one of the wonderful effects of CICRA, is sort of stimulating young people to do research into Crohn's, and he's going to tell us about his project.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. I'll just get this going. So thanks for that introduction. Yeah, I'm Zach. I'm a paediatric trainee, and I'm newly appointed CICRA Research Fellow starting in Southampton, and a PhD student as part of that. Before I was appointed to this role, I was working in Cardiff and was awarded a John Earnshaw grant, so a little bit of money to do a project. And that project was called Nimbus, which stands for Non-Invasive Monitoring Through Bowel Ultrasound. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what's next after that project. So as I've said, we're going to talk about what that project was exactly, why we did it, and focusing on the kind of priorities that we were listening to from clinicians that we were working with in our department, and also children and young people that were accessing our service with inflammatory bowel disease. We're sort of undergoing the process of data analysis and statistical analysis at the moment, but we'll talk about some of the things that are coming out in what we're finding in the results from that project. What's next following that? And then also I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent and talk about what I'm going to do during my research training fellowship and my PhD, which is very exciting, involves things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. So everyone in the room will mostly be familiar with the way in which we monitor inflammation in inflammatory bowel disease, which is a combination of lots of these things. And I think the gold standard for monitoring inflammation and for diagnosing IBD, we know, is ileocolic, colonoscopic biopsy and appreciation of the tissues in the GI tract, so having a look at the bowel directly through camera tests. Now, that's obviously a fantastic way of visualizing what's going on directly, but also we can look at inflammation down a microscope and see what's going on a cellular level. That test is fantastic, but it's not an easy thing to do. You have to often have an anaesthetic to do it. There's not a procedure that's without risks. There's bowel prep that needs to be taken, and lots of people have to travel quite a long distance to have those tests done. You know, I work in Southampton. If you live on the Isle of Wight, you've got to come to Southampton to have that test done. So that's time off school, time off work for people. We can look at the bit of the bowel that we can't see with a camera with three-dimensional imaging, so MRI studies, or also with something called capsule endoscopy, where you swallow a pill camera. Those tests are great. There's lots of data that come from them, but there's also lots of medicines that have to be taken with them. There's anaesthetic risks, again, with those. Not everyone can swallow a capsule, so actually sometimes you have to have an endoscopy to drop that down. So again, not perfect tests. So in order to kind of get an idea of what's going on with someone's condition and their IBD, we have to do a combination of looking at blood tests and poo tests. And again, those tests aren't perfect. We don't directly visualize the bowel. The poo test can be affected by lots of other things, what medicines you're taking, how long they take to get to the lab. And actually, the feedback that we were getting in Cardiff at the time that this project was devised was that people didn't really like bringing their poo tests into clinic, and actually found that lots of people weren't doing it. And then when they were, we were waiting kind of 3 to 4 weeks to get results back. So coming up and so looking at those advantages and disadvantages of those different tests, we got together and talked to some of the children and young people that were using our services and talked about what sort of ideal things they would look for in a way in which we could monitor disease. And also we talked to the clinical team about what they wanted to monitor and what we wanted to achieve in monitoring people with IBD. The targets for treatment are becoming increasingly stringent, and what we want to kind of get people not just symptomatically better from IBD, but also to make sure that the gut is as normal as it can be and that it's healing. So we need to, from a clinical side of things, introduce more monitoring. And actually, if we think about the way in which we've traditionally been doing it, none of it is ideal. So it's kind of balancing the priorities of both the clinical team and families and young people with IBD to kind of come together with something that's a kind of solution that works for both of those things. So that's what we thought about doing something with ultrasound. So ultrasound is something that's very established for looking at the organs in the abdomen, and it's used in lots of different clinical contexts. But what was coming out in the work at the time in scientific literature is that there's an increasing amount of use of ultrasound for actually monitoring inflammation in IBD, and that's being mainly done in adult populations, but also in a few European cohorts in children. And what we knew from that work was that we didn't know what we could measure in children, we didn't know if this was something that was possible to be done, and we didn't know whether that this is something that the paediatric population would be amenable to having done. If ultrasound were to be something that could be used, though, it's got lots of advantages over those other tests. You can do it fairly quickly, you don't need to have any bowel prep, you get a result straight away, and also what's good is you can show someone what you're seeing on the screen, so you can talk through kind of if there's inflammation or if things are getting better or worse, which is quite a good thing for children and young people to have, to be able to appreciate what's going on and what they're doing well or what could be done a bit better. Ultrasound's pretty ubiquitous, it's available in most hospitals, so there would hypothetically be shorter waiting lists, and that would definitely be an advantage for lots of things. So with the project, we aim to set out, firstly, could we recruit? Could we get people to do this? In Cardiff, there wasn't much of a culture of us doing any research projects, especially in the kind of paediatric gastroenterology world. So that was one of the big things we were going to be looking at. Could we measure what other people had started to measure in European studies? And what we were going to find, was that going to match up with the results of the blood tests and the poo tests that we traditionally use to monitor inflammation? So we put together Nimbus and we started recruiting in May of 2023. We just finished recruiting in August of this year. And that was put together in combination with, as I've mentioned, a John Earnshaw grant from CICRA and some money that we got from the Children's Hospital in Cardiff. And what we did was we enrolled about 40 patients into our study. We took details for what disease type they had, if they had more kind of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis type picture, what medicines they were on, and then the results of their blood and poo tests. And then everyone had an ultrasound where we tried to measure all these different parameters or these different features that were coming out in other literature. And then we looked at the blood and fecal calprotectin at that time. And then we followed our patients up to a median time of about 3 months to see whether or not they went up or down on their treatment, or whether or not what we found in the ultrasound led to kind of demonstrated whether or not their calprotectin was going to go up or down. So, as I've mentioned, we did really well with our recruitment. Our target was 40 to 50 people, and we achieved that. We found that it was possible to actually do this, to get people to recruit, to get them to stay on the study, to actually measure these parameters. We're currently writing up at the moment, but in the first sort of wave of our statistical analysis, it appears that with children with ulcerative colitis, the bowel thickness, kind of how inflamed or how thick the bowel wall looks, does seem to measure up and correlate with the fecal calprotectin result. So that's a positive, and then that demonstrates what we assumed to be the case, and to give more evidence to that, which is that ultrasound potentially can be used to quantify some of the things that we're already quantifying with our blood and poo test that we already use to monitor inflammation. So the next question is what we do with that information and what is next. This was a very small little project where we recruited a few people, and we kind of had about 2/3 of that population being ulcerative colitis, and it's coming out more since we've started putting the project together that this is probably going to be a tool that's more useful in colitis type disease rather than Crohn's disease. So I think doing that on a kind of bigger population, more children with that sort of type of disease would be useful. But I think the possibilities of introducing this to clinical practice is still quite a way off. But I think what would be really interesting is to start to see how these ultrasound features change over time within one patient, to see whether or not we can do this both at the time of endoscopy, to see if it correlates with what we find on doing those camera tests, but also if it could be used, for example, during infliximab induction, to see if that shows us, gives us a better idea into what's going on in a quick and easy way, so that we might be able to predict if someone's not doing so well on those treatments, we could maybe start to think about switching to a different medicine sooner. And again, what the aim of this is trying to bring about is kind of personalising care in our IBD management. You know, kind of being able to decide or to see earlier on who's got the sort of disease that isn't maybe responding to treatment, to be able to then identify who needs more, or maybe those children or young people that we're actually winning with, that we might be able to kind of stick where we are. In international kind of clinical groups, there's quite a lot of uptake of ultrasound into the clinic. Our ultrasounds are all done by paediatric radiologists. The kind of uptake across Europe and in America is among gastroenterologists doing this at the bedside or in clinic, but we're a long way off from kind of getting that at the forefront of our training, or even starting to build kind of groups to train that within paediatric gastroenterology in the UK. So I've been looking at kind of, as a sub kind of project, setting up a way in which we can access these tools to be able to learn to do this and to be able to introduce it a bit more into our practice. And I've been doing that through the adult societies that do bowel ultrasound in the UK. So that sort of sums up where we are with Nimbus and what's going to happen going forward with that. I just thought I'd take the opportunity now to talk a little bit about what I'm going to do over the next 3 years as part of my research training fellowship. So as I've alluded to, one of the things that I think the kind of silver bullet, or the kind of the big pie in the sky dream for how we would manage people with inflammatory bowel diseases, we'd be able to decide or to see early on what sort of disease you have, but also what sort of problems you're more likely to have and what sort of course of disease you're likely to have from the moment or from the first few months of which you're diagnosed. And that's currently very difficult for us to do. There are some types of IBD that have particular genes that suggest that your disease might behave in some way, but those associations aren't kind of the same amongst all all of inflammatory bowel disease. And what we do know is that some patients will go and have more surgery, or some will not respond to a particular drug. We just don't know how we can pick those out. What we do also have is loads of data now. So the way in which health records are stored, particularly in units like ours, is that we're able to kind of anonymously extract large volumes of clinical data from the NHS database and also from our genomics cohort in order to be able to get things like WHO tests for hundreds of thousands of results, essentially. I think we've actually got something like 3 million individual data points for the cohort we have in Southampton. And what we can collect as well is we can collect things like blood and poo and map those things over time to see what is happening with different disease types. The other thing that's really exciting that we're working on at the moment is looking at how we can use some of the other data from other tests that I've talked about, so things like our endoscopy tests or MRI information, which is traditionally reported in a clinical sense as kind of free text. So what I'm doing at the moment is working with our bioinformatics team to teach something, a model like ChatGPT, how to pull clinical data out of those reports. And what that will be useful for is to be able to kind of quantify what the results that we find on those things and to be able to use those in a research context, but also hopefully to be able to predict over time, which, you know, that gives us another data point by which we can use to predict how people's care is going to go. That's going to be using AI, essentially. So the main way in which we're going to be able to look for patterns in disease and to identify subgroups of children with inflammatory bowel disease is using AI. And that what we can do is build models that will kind of group patients together with finding patterns that wouldn't be visible to us. One of the things that's also really exciting is lots of these large language models like ChatGPT are all on the kind of cusp of being able to interpret audio-visual data. So what we're doing at the moment is taking a load of prose that says this colonoscopy shows X, Y, and Z, and trying to make that clinically interpretable or research interpretable, trying to quantify what's found. What you would be able to do going forward is hopefully put in a histological slide, so some cells under a microscope, what that looks like, or maybe some pictures from an MRI, and then take that to extract the clinical information that could then be used in research and then hopefully eventually in clinical practice to help identify which children have got what type of disease and how things are going to go going forward. So that's that. I'd like to thank CICRA for asking me to talk and for all their support, and I'd like to thank their children's charities in Cardiff for their support with Nimbus.
So we probably do have time for a question or two if anyone would like to ask anything, to shout out.
Someone like that?
Well, here we are.
Yes, sir. Yes, you, Mr. Green, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Green, in your research, have you found the reason for IBS? Is it genetic or epigenetic?
For IBD? Well, so there are some types of IBD that have got quite clear links in specific genes cause specific problems, but you're right, in terms of epigenetics and kind of complicated, lots of different genes coming together to kind of interact with the environment, what we eat, other things we're exposed to, that's thought to be the kind of prevailing reason that we get IBD when we're kind of older or in our teenage years. So it's kind of a complex mixture of the environment and our genes.
There is another speaker coming soon who will probably talk a bit about this. So,
And ask Jochen.
you can ask the question again then. Any other questions?
Let's do it at the back. So I think uptake amongst paediatric radiologists is certainly exploding. So within the department in Cardiff that I was working in and in Southampton, there was kind of 2 or 3 paediatric radiologists who are very happy to do a specialised bowel ultrasound. It's part of our kind of ECHO-ESPGHAN guidance is to image the small bowel in some way in most diagnosis of IBD unless it's clear ulcerative colitis. So they're getting quite a lot of scans coming through as the incidence of IBD comes up. I don't know what that's like in other centres, but there's definitely more uptake from radiologists and therefore more kind of people who are happy to comment. The technology's also come on a lot, it would seem. So, we used a single radiologist to kind of reduce the noise between different people reporting scans during this. But actually, at the start of the project, she got a new scanner that actually made it infinitely easier to visualize all these different parameters in the bowel. So I think we think of ultrasound as something that's quite static and hasn't changed historically, but actually it's evolved quite a lot. So I think there are definitely more people that are taking it on. Hi, Jochen.
Hi, Zach. Fantastic talk. So, a very quick comment on that, because I think one of the things with ultrasound is, as you said, it's pretty operator dependent still. And I think even our radiologists, as I think it's a very good comment, they're actually not formally trained in it. So for them to actually do regular ultrasound is also something very new. So I suppose one of the big challenges is not so much the actual technology, it's actually about training radiologists and possibly gastroenterologists to do it properly, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think the mindset here is trying to get into something from a kind of point of care point of view, as in done by a user at a bedside. So quite often in medicine, if you kind of are in an accident and a doctor wants to look at your chest, they might put an ultrasound probe on to just look to see if there's blood or something there, but it might not be a scan that's necessarily reported in a very methodical way. You're using it in the same way you might use a stethoscope or feel a pulse. And I think the way in which I envisage this being used by the paediatric gastroenterologist is possibly not in this very regimented formal report, more as a sense of being able to measure one particular parameter, like bowel thickness maybe, which might be more achievable for a less experienced clinician to be able to do, but at least then to be able to document that over time in one person. I think that's a useful piece of information.
There's got a question up there. We have one or two more questions, and do save some up for later as well.
I just wanted to ask, because you said that you found your results really helped with colitis. Are you still carrying on to see if it helps with Crohn's as well?
Yeah, so we'll still be, we're very early on in analysing the data that we've got. I think it's what it appears to be in terms of the, like Jochen's alluded to, it's quite a difficult thing to do, to visualise lots of parts of the bowel. And I think if you're doing that as a kind of gross overview, I think the findings that you get in colitis appear to be much more easy for the radiologist doing the scan to pick up. I think that we definitely have noticed that there are things we can measure in Crohn's disease that will come out in this that will be measurable and therefore could be measured over time into terms of treatment, but what they mean and how to kind of do that in a more nuanced, standardised way is a bit tough.
So that's a yes.
Yes. Sorry.
One last question. Okay, so everyone. Okay, well that was great. Thanks very much, Zach. That was a very nice presentation. Now we're lucky enough, as one of the the most important people here, of course, there are young people who have these conditions, and we're very lucky today that Simeon's come all the way from Sheffield to tell us a bit about what it's been like for him as a patient with the condition. So, Simeon, it's fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Well done.
Hello, my name is Simeon, and I'm going to present to you today is what my hectic whirlwind of life has been like. I'm 14 now, but all started at 6. The walls that slammed in my way that I turned into climbing frames to overcome, and the incredible journey it's taken me on through the diagnosis of Crohn's in 2018 to great success, heart-wrenching disappointments, and the travels of the world with my sport diving. However, it's not just my story. My story includes my family, the nurses and doctors, and all the friends I made from all different areas of life. My story really starts at the budding age of 6. Every week, I watch the art of my brother, who is 4 years older than me, and all the others divers dive in, and gaze longingly, wishing that could be me, gliding through the air with immaculate form and technique, slicing through the water, performing the perfect disappearing act. Before long, I was following in their footsteps, training 1 day a week to learn the basics the best I could. Just a year later, I began to become rather ill with religious trips to the doctors over the winter of 2017 and increasingly excessive trips to the toilet. Eventually, I was referred to the hospital where I had a colonoscopy and endoscopy performed on me and was diagnosed with Crohn's in the early stages of my diving career. I was admitted to the hospital immediately after, where I stayed 3 grueling days and 3 tedious nights. However, there was a light in every storm. My brother, who I looked up to greatly, dropped off 3 cordial post-it notes, 1 for every day. "You're doing very well. Stay strong. Proud of you," were some of the words that helped keep me going. My Year 3 teacher took it upon herself to visit and brighten my day in the best way you can for a 7-year-old, slime and games. With ups come downs, and I had to spend our Jewish celebration of Passover on a video call with my grandparents, the first time ever I hadn't been with them in person. At the end of those dreadful few days, I had yet another tough challenge ahead of me. 6 weeks of drinks-only diet and daily azathioprine. But diving played an essential role in my will to push through it. Towards the end of my 6 weeks, I had my first ever diving competition out of Sheffield in Bradford. The nurses courteously upped the allowance of how many drinks I could have in a day, so I could have enough energy to train and hopefully compete. The help from the hospital and my family, who helped me create a chart to ensure I was meeting my drinks targets, was a key aid in the motivation to keep me going. I was waking up early to have one of just 4 flavours of Fortisip for my breakfast. I was having weekly blood tests. I was working my socks off for a competition that I managed to compete in and perform to the best of my ability, which was even better thanks to the help of my family and friends. Not long after, I was back off the drinks diet, but unfortunately had only made some minor improvements in my health. Furthermore, the limited progress I had made was shoved right back to where it was before I had enjoyed the 6 weeks of drinks-only dieting. With the drinks failing at the first hurdle, I had a crucial decision forced upon me. Let the drinks finish their race, or steroids. While the drinks proved inept the first time round, I was willing to give them one more try, as steroids was the absolute last thing I could ever have wanted at that time. Nevertheless, this bout of drinks was only going to turn out much more arduous than the first. A family trip to Greece, a time meant for celebration, a celebration of their culture and cuisine, a celebration I had to endure rather than relish like the rest of my family could. Food is still one of my favourite things in life, but back then it was all I ever wanted, yet could never have. It was dangled in front of my face like bait, as my family tucked into their array of Greek delicacies. Fortunately, on some occasions of meals, I could sit off on the beach with a Fortisip that we had turned into an ice lolly and somewhat forget what I was missing out on. Luckily, before long, I was back home and eating all I could. I first got involved with CICRA in December 2018, 9 months after my diagnosis. My mum and I held a stand at my junior school, selling gorgeous bracelets handmade by her, raffle tickets, and bendy pencils. We achieved the ability to donate £183 to a charity that helps many others facing similar challenges and obstacles to me. In my eyes, the drive and motivation that diving was still providing me with significantly sustained my capacity to overcome those hurdles. Diving was becoming more and more prominent as I was now competing nationally by July 2019. And then everything changed. I was put onto my miracle drug. Some medicines work differently for everyone, and Infliximab saved everything for me. It was the first drug to work perfectly. At that point, I felt on top of the world. Apart from 6 weekly day trips to the hospital, I was living my life with no setbacks, and I could fully commit to diving with no worries. With this commitment came bigger and better opportunities. My first considerable test, a competition called Talent Games, which gave me the chance to work my way onto the England diving pathway. I trained my hardest for weeks on end, and when the time came, I snatched it and secured my spot on the Team England zone camp. This was a huge step at the time and was an essential stepping stone in my diving journey. Across 2019 and 2020, while the Infliximab continued to work its wonders, I got to travel all across the UK to both compete and attend 3-day camps courtesy of Team England. I was winning medals at both a regional and national level and beginning to make my way through the tough yet compelling diving adventure. Alongside this hectic life, my family and I had been putting aside any money we had found on the floor and money from selling cards that my grandma made, and by January 2020, we had racked up £162 to donate to CICRA. Unfortunately, in January 2020, the whole world had a major setback, COVID. However, like all the other setbacks I had faced, with the help of my diving team, we persevered. Training sessions on Zoom calls every single weekday, and only being able to do minimal amounts of training and limited amounts of what we could do in these training sessions. Again, we never gave up on our search for money on the floor to donate, so, with the help of family and friends, we managed to collect another £152 by January 2021. Luckily, after what had felt like an age, we were in a position to get stuck back into proper training, getting ready to compete. With more competitions and a move up to the highest category in junior diving, I was getting ready to compete at the Junior British Nationals in early 2022. This was going to be my first ever junior nationals, so I had very little experience and limited expectations. It was going to be the biggest competition I'd ever attended, with some divers travelling all the way from USA to compete. My coach, of roughly 3 years at the time, put her all into the preparation of my squad for this competition, and we all reaped the rewards. Myself coming home with a proud silver and 2 bronzes, and my squad bringing home 3 golds, 2 silvers and 3 bronzes between 7 of us. Such success brought even greater rewards, the next big stepping stone, a move up to the next England squad. And with this good news came even more great news, as we held a stand selling my late grandfather's handmade wooden products, earning £331 to Grant CICRA in July of 2022. Shortly after this was yet again more exciting news. I was going back to Greece with my family to indulge in what I had missed out on the first time round. Along with the step up in the England squad at the end of 2022 came my biggest and best challenge yet, a proper England call-up to compete abroad in Canada against many other countries. This was my most formidable challenge to date, as I was to represent my country against 30 other divers representing theirs. Competitions like this one with England were chaperoned, so I had to monitor my medicines with the help of the Team England coaches and team managers. All my hard work paid off, and I performed as well as I could have, taking an astounding gold and bronze home with me, but I couldn't have done it without the incredible network of the diving community. The competition in Canada was a catapult in my diving career, and immediately I was flying. 2 months later, I was competing internationally again, this time for club rather than country, but still a major competition, as the others were competing for country. I was in the Netherlands, and my good performances did not yield, as I ventured through the tricky field of divers to come out with a hard-earned gold and 2 silvers. I was riding high off the back of such good performances that gave me confidence going to April's Junior British National 2023. Again, with the help of my dedicated coach, my team and I prepared thoroughly, and it all paid off when I came out on top of my category with 3 out of 3 gold medals. The only person at the competition to complete such a feat. This performance confirmed my reselection for another year of the England squad camp. Whilst there were no more international competitions with England that year, my club and I travelled to Croatia to compete in another club international in July. This again bore more fruit as I pushed through training during storms and competing while the sun set on the outdoor pool. I proved my name internationally yet again, claiming 2 golds and a silver. We also did another fundraiser, selling assorted handmade gifts and acquiring an exciting £318, our biggest donation yet, bringing home our total donations to over £1,000. This was a great season for me, as I really made a strong name for myself both nationally and internationally. Fortunately for me, where there were great seasons, there were even better ones right around the corner. In 2024, a move up to the age category above was going to prove more difficult, but also allowed me to compete internationally for Great Britain, a dream for me since I first jumped off a diving board. Coming home from the Netherlands empty-handed this time round was a clear demonstration of how challenging the year ahead was going to be. Luckily, I had saved my best for the most important competition of the year, Junior British Nationals 2024. I demolished personal bests on every board and grappled my way to 2 golds and a silver, cementing myself as one of the best dives in Britain for my age. And, as I said before, with success comes even greater opportunities. A long-awaited Great Britain call-up. Whilst I didn't perform to the best of my abilities, a trip to Germany to compete against some of the best divers from all over the world. Whilst I didn't perform to the best of my abilities, I still earned 2 top 7 performances. Alongside the diving is the ever-growing network of people within diving that I had met along the way, and the experiences are unparalleled for me. Another GB call-up to compete at the Junior Europeans in Poland was confirmed, and I was given another chance to compete against all the best dives in Europe. With 2 out of 2 strong top 8 performances, I solidified my name in with those of the best of Europe. People who I am thankful to call my friends. All these people, my family, friends, nurses and diving network, have helped me be the best version of myself today. I wouldn't be close to where I am without them.
I think we'll save Simeon questions, but I'm sure he'll chat to you at tea break. I mean, that is utterly amazing. Fantastic. Well done. So, yeah, Simeon, you're an example to us all, actually. Next, Dr. Kammermeyer from the Evelina Children's Hospital is going to update us a little bit about early onset IBD and very early onset IBD. And thank you very much, Jochen.
Thank you, no worries. So my first comment is for Simon. I think, do you know why these stories are so helpful? Because often we sit in clinic and we have these relatively hollow phrases in saying, yeah, you can do whatever you want, don't worry about it. And I think these stories help us a lot to kind of give that back and say, actually, you can actually do whatever you want. And I think you can achieve everything in life what you want. So I think that's really, really helpful. Thank you so much for that story. That's pretty cool. Okay, so I want to talk about very early onset and early onset inflammatory bowel disease today. Now, when I was given that topic, and obviously very grateful for CICRA to inviting me to talk about this topic. Obviously, we could fill that topic with probably a 6-hour talk easily. So I've kind of condensed 6 hours in 20 minutes, okay? So you need to be really switched on now. So basically, I want to talk about a little bit of incidence and prevalence. So how often does it actually occur each year, inflammatory bowel disease in young children? Talk about ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and then that in-between thing, so IBD unclassified, that's sort of a mix between Crohn's and ulcerative colitis possibly, and how that distribution changes across the ages. And then it becomes a bit complicated, so I need you guys to really focus. I want to try to explain the concepts of a polygenic, what we call normal conventional inflammatory bowel disease versus very rare cases of monogenic inflammatory bowel disease. And the reason why that's important, because the topic is obviously very early onset inflammatory bowel disease, and these very rare forms of inflammatory bowel disease, we see them much, much more often in the younger age group. And then a little bit of the story of monogenic inflammatory bowel disease. And I'm very, very pleased that, again, I've got Professor Saunderson here as well, who's sitting right in the middle, who will feature very strongly in that story as well. Last but not least, a few comments on therapies for children that are very young, and possibly also limitations, which is a little bit of a sad topic in that sense. So let's start with terminology. So when we're talking about pediatric inflammatory bowel disease, these are basically young people under 18 years, early onset, younger than 10, very early onset, younger than 6 years, and then a very, very rare group of infantile onset inflammatory bowel disease, younger than 2 years of age. So I've got a little quiz prepared as well, so I'm going to randomly pick people now and answer that first question. Okay, I'm going to point with my laser. I hope it's not going to damage anyone's eyes. Okay, so I'm going to go, Simon, why don't you start? Okay, so what do you think? So that is the number of newly diagnosed children with inflammatory bowel disease per year is actually going up, or it's going down. What do you think? Boom. Correct. So generally, the incidence and prevalence of inflammatory bowel disease has been researched, many, many, many different times. I suppose the most important take-home messages are that the highest reported prevalence, so people with inflammatory bowel disease in various parts of the world, are probably highest in Europe and North America. And I think one take-home message is that within the next, I suppose, 5 to 10 years, 1% of the population will have inflammatory bowel disease. And that's 1% of the population. Rising incidences, that mean new cases coming up, particularly in newly industrialized countries like in Africa, Asia, and South America. If we're looking at the children's age group, so this graph shows it's a Canadian cohort from 1904 to 2009, shows different age groups. So the red line is the one from 10 to 17 years. The blue line are the ones from 6 to 10 years, and then this sort of purple line here are the very early onset inflammatory bowel disease kids. And basically across these different age ranges, the incidence, meaning the new patients with inflammatory bowel disease, is going up. The same we can say about the Southampton cohort that our friend James has produced. Zach, were you involved in this as well? Fantastic. So you probably know that graph better than I do. But I think, again, the take-home message is that overall the incidence is going up. I think, if I report that correctly, your very young kids, probably the incidence wasn't going up to such an extent then compared to the Canadian cohort. But still, certainly overall, children with inflammatory bowel disease becoming more and more common. So, the next attack. Young children with inflammatory bowel disease have a lower proportion of disease that is less classifiable compared to the adults. Is that correct or is that incorrect? Tish, what do you think? That is correct. As in it's incorrect. Very good. So, this is old data, but I think it proves the point very well. This is an American multi-center study that looked at a huge group of kids, young kids with inflammatory bowel disease, and then reporting when they presented first, so from 0 to 17 years. So it becomes quite clear that the majority of these children present between probably sort of 10 and 15. That's probably reflected in our practice as well. But I think the more interesting thing is this graph is split between Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and then IBD unclassified. Now, it becomes quite clear that this unclassified version is much more common in the very young. And we've done some work now 8 years ago in the large cohort of patients who presented very early, so younger than 2 years of life. And again, we really struggled, particularly for these very young ones, to classify them clearly into Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So now it's going to get really molecular. So whoever has an interest in biology, that's your time now. So we're talking about polygenic, conventional, or probably just normal IBD, if that's a word. And the question is, in polygenic, conventional, standard IBD, genetic and environmental factors play a role in disease development, A, or B, only genetic factors play a role, or C, only environmental factors play a role. Pratima, one of your boys. Sorry guys, if I know you, then obviously it's tough luck today, okay? So you kind of, so what have they been? Are you guys on your phone? Come on, look up from your phones for a second and give me a letter, A, B, or C. Let's check. Correct. Very good. Future doctors, very good. Or probably not, because they see how horrible our job is. Anyway, so let's do a deep dive into the gut. So that's kind of our gut. So we know small bowel and large bowel. So we look further in. That's what we do as gastroenterologists. We look into the bowel with an endoscope. That's a nice little healthy-looking colon there. And then if we go a little bit further down, we look under the microscope. That's our second favorite toy. And we see this really nice little structure of the gut lining and these deep little crypts and these tiny little dots that are inflammation cells that help us to deal with infection, inflammation, and keep everything at bay. Now, if things don't go well, like in this case in inflammatory bowel disease, that's how it looks like. So, ulceration, inflammation, redness, swelling. And if we're going further down again, we're seeing that these nice little crypts and structures that you saw before are completely eaten away by inflammation, as it's shown here. And these tiny little purple dots, again, these are inflammatory cells that are damaging the gut lining. I'm a little bit disappointed that all the kids are now gone, because I've done this little, this little comic thing here, and now no one will finding that interesting. But it is, so basically that's the gut lining here again, and so this is kind of the bloodstream. So you can get your kids back now, just to look at that, please, okay? Just that bit. So basically, that's the poo, and these are the sort of commensals, meaning sort of good normal bacteria that we need to develop in general, and then these little bad guys are nasty bacteria or pathogens. So usually what happens is our immune system constantly probes and sees what's out there, and usually there's a first-line immune defense, the innate immune system, that kind of mops up and kills these bugs, or indeed presents them to a more targeted, slightly delayed form of immune system, which is the adaptive immune system. Now, if we're now going one step a little bit more complicated, That's what really happens in our gut. So basically, again, you've got these guys, the part of the innate immune system that probes out there in the gut lumen where all the bugs and bacteria are sitting, seeing what's out there, bringing it inside, presenting it to immune cells who can then form a targeted attack to make sure that that bug is killed. And there's also a general sort of other general immune cells that actually are killing these bugs as we go along instantly. Now, all this is orchestrated and messaged by different molecules that the body uses, the immune system uses, to kind of, first of all, create an inflammation, but then also turns that inflammation off again. So that happens all the time in all of us. Now, the message is, if you compare a large cohort of patients with inflammatory bowel disease with a cohort of people who don't have inflammatory bowel disease, you see that there's hundreds of genes slightly altered in patients with inflammatory bowel disease versus patients who don't have inflammatory bowel disease. Now, all these genes that I'm referring to are sort of mostly sitting in that process of how the body reacts to a pathogen and how a body deals with stressors that come from the lumen. Now, in that sense, it's sort of a machinery that's already struggling a little bit, okay? What then happens, you've got environmental factors as we go along with time that stress that system even further. This could be, obviously, our diet, our westernized diet, which we heard a lot about, certain infections, certain other stressors, non-steroidal, medication, appendicectomy, smoking, antibiotics. So all these things push and pressurize the system until it breaks down and inflammatory bowel disease develops. So that's the sort of the concept of what happens at the moment in inflammatory bowel disease. Now, there is another very rare form of inflammatory bowel disease which we need to talk about, particularly when we're looking at very, very small children in that context. Here's the next question. The concept here is monogenic inflammatory bowel disease. So there are cases where the non-functioning or the defect of one single gene causes inflammatory bowel disease. It's very rare, but it's something we need to discuss. So in highly selected cases, we are screening for defects in approximately how many genes when monogenic IBD is suspected? Is it 10? Is it 100? Or do we know more about 1,000 genes now when it comes to inflammatory bowel disease? So who wants to have a go? A, B, or C? If I get no answers, I'm going to randomly pick Professor Saunderson. What do you think?
I was dreading, I was looking away.
Oh, gosh, stay here. Oh, here.
I can say B.
Good. I would have not known what to say now if you had got it wrong. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So that's actually correct. It's about 102 genes that we have now published that are associated with inflammatory bowel disease. Now, I want to give you a quick story. A little boy coming to my clinic, poor weight gain, bloody diarrhea, since 6 weeks of age. So like most of these presenting at this age, we presume it's a cowsmic allergy. That's very much the first differential diagnosis that we are facing. And indeed, it's also one of the factors that mostly delays the diagnosis at this age. So we looked at that in detail in our cohorts and actually presumed milk allergy is what usually delays the diagnosis most. At 9 months, he comes to the Evelina, presenting with anemia, low albumin, raised inflammatory markers, raised stool calprotectin. We've done a basic immune workup that we usually do in these cases, particularly when they're really young. And actually, there wasn't really much to see. And you can see, you've seen these growth charts in clinic, he's actually kind of hovering along the sort of lower area here, so not particularly great. He had 2 endoscopies, one a diagnosis and one after some therapy. And again, you see these sort of white patches, these ulcers. So it doesn't really look very good. So he went through a journey of different medicines, steroids, mesalazine, exclusive endonutrition, antibiotics, eventually needing adalimumab, which I think probably you're aware of. Some of the kids and adults are using adalimumab. And these are disease activity markers that we're plotting here. And as you can see, these markers remain really high. So at the same time, at the start, we sent genetics, which is now available in the NHS to screen for monogenic diseases. And we could find that this child has a specific gene defect basically knocking one gene out, and that gene is crucially involved in all these different immune pathways that I was talking about earlier. So in that sense, this child was not able to regulate inflammation and had a persistent drive of inflammation, and therefore what we saw then is basically IBD. We then knew about that genetic diagnosis, which first of all helped us to use some of the medicines a bit more targeted for that condition. Unfortunately, that didn't work for this little boy, and now he's undergone a bone marrow transplantation. So he basically had to change his entire immune system over to a new one, and obviously we hope he will do well. I think the reason why this is so important, because it also showed by getting the genetic diagnosis for this boy, we were kind of able to change what we're doing, and we kind of adjust what we're doing, which probably would have not been. Oh, guys, you missed my oh, sorry. Anyway. So now a quick history of the monogenic IBD story. And that's why, so this is Professor Saunderson's first paper. Not your first paper, but sorry, one of the papers which I think was absolutely seminal in that story as well. Because that story, that paper sort of kicked off that idea, if you don't mind me saying, that there is most likely a genetic cause for some of these conditions. This was a group of children within families that had very, very severe, very, very early inflammatory bowel disease. And that story then went on. Probably 20 years later, we had the very first, through the advances of genetic technologies, report of basically specific genes being damaged and causing inflammatory bowel disease. Then, through newer genetic technologies, we were able to screen not only 1 or 2 or 3 genes, but the entire genome, which then led to further discoveries there. Our group, about 10 years ago, published the first sort of clinical screening tool for a number of genes. At the time, we only had about 30. And then slowly genetic screening became standard of care. So people were thinking about how do we work children that present very early up in terms of their immune system and in terms of their genetics. And now we do have national and international guidelines how to screen these children, one coming from our European society. And I think the absolute success story and the most important step is now that genetic screening for a cohort of patients is part of NHS treatment. So genomic medicine can facilitate a diagnosis and then can enable the selection of effective treatments, which I think is very, very important. But we need to be aware this is very rare. So only about probably 15 to 20% of children that present in their first year of life will have one single gene defect that causes IBD. So that's extremely rare. And as you can see already, in the second year, this plummets down. And as you're going up to 15 years, then obviously we are way below 1%. So then you might ask, so how do I know who to screen or not? And there's now published guidelines from last year, which was a joint work with adults and pediatrics that we've done. And we now say all children younger than 2 years need to be screened. If children present younger than 6 years, they would probably need to have more symptoms that make us worried. For example, they have recurrent severe infections. For example, they have other features that suggest they might have a genetic problem. They have very, very distinct changes on endoscopy, on histology, or there are certain malignancies, so cancers that are associated with that as well that we would screen out. And obviously, if there's a strong family history of children who do have monogenic IBD, that's kind of obvious. And then that's probably the very important point as well. Whenever you're going into a therapy that you can't reverse, like, for example, bone marrow transplantation that I just said, you can't reverse a bone marrow transplantation, or big resection of the bowel, you probably just want to make sure you're not missing one of these conditions. Good. Next question. Therapies and therapy limitations. That's the last chapter in young children with inflammatory bowel disease. So who else do I know in the audience? I think we now need to volunteer. Very young children with IBD usually respond very well to first-line treatment and have access to all novel therapies. may not respond very well to first-line therapy, and access to novel therapies are somewhat limited, and C, usually don't need therapy because the inflammation is self-resolving. Who wants to have a go? Very good. Now he's woken up. What do you think? I think B is correct, isn't it? Now, I have to say now, I think I have another couple of minutes. Is that right? So I'm counting 19 minutes. Really? Okay. So most of this data is somewhat depends where you get it from, which center, US, Europe, and I think we need to be careful because whenever we're looking at these cohorts, these are very small cohorts, okay? So this one is an American cohort which looked at the need for surgery in very early onset inflammatory bowel disease, that's black, versus older kids, that's gray and white. So you can see, for example, in very young kids, they needed ileostomies more than others. They needed colectomies more than others. They didn't need ileocecal resections more than others because that's probably something we do a bit more in the older kids. So that's kind of probably understandable. Now, here this is the failure to therapy. So again, black versus white, early onset children failed more often to infliximab and immunomodulators than older kids. I have to say, again, that's a little controversial. Sometimes you look at other cohorts where that's not quite that clear, but certainly there's a question about, whether early onset inflammatory bowel disease, very early onset inflammatory disease, is a bit more therapy refractory than others. Now, I think you've got enough of biology now. I just want to highlight a few things now. We do have many, many, many really exciting and very cool drugs coming onto the market. And that is really, really good. If we're looking back 20 years ago, to be honest, I suppose we had steroids and then steroids and sometimes steroids. Now we have a huge market, for really, really good, exciting drugs. And I'm not drug or pharmacy sponsored. It's really exciting to see that there's really lots of options out there. Some drugs trap our immune cells in the lymphatic tissue, and therefore they can't do damage. Some drugs would not allow some of these activated nasty cells to come from the bloodstream into the tissue. Some drugs would block that signal that says, come here and inflame my gut, to be blocked away. And you've heard all these names. You heard ustekinumab, adalimumab, vedolizumab. You've heard all these names before. So there's a huge range of exciting new drugs. There's one problem, though, and that's that. So this is old data from 2005 to 2021. 7 new exciting drugs were approved for adults, 2 for children. And that gets even worse if you're looking at that. Forget about the table in general. I want you to focus on 2 colors, and that is that table and that table. These are all the new drugs that are coming through different research strategies. These are all the ones that are approved for adults, and these are the ones for children. So there's a huge unmet need that we have access, safe access, because that's really important for these kids, particularly for the very, very young. And I think that's something we really have to work on in coming years. We are working on this already, but there's more work that needs to be done. So key messages from our talk today: IBD incidence is rising, which you guys have answered correctly. Higher rates of IBD unclassified in younger children. A small proportion of mostly, but not exclusively, very young children can have inflammatory bowel disease that's triggered by one gene defect. Young IBD children might be a little bit more therapy refractory or resistant to therapy. And I suppose in general, the therapeutic approach in young children with standard, normal, polygenic, conventional IBD is otherwise actually quite similar to older children. And I think that's one last plea. The access to novel therapies is limited, and I think we need to really hard to make sure that we change that in the future. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jochen. We'll keep things moving, but Jochen is around. We have a question and answer session later, so do collar him for questions. I've got a question for him as well, but I'll put it in the Q&A later. You may remember we got some breakout sessions. One of them is aimed for really teenagers, young or even young adults who just want to go into a room and chat together without their parents there. And the idea is that you can go there and you can talk about things that maybe you don't want to talk about when your mum and dad are in the room. And Tish and Sab are two nurse specialists here in London who are brilliant and fantastic and loads of experience of talking to our young patients. So they've kindly offered to go and be available to help sort of direct conversations, answer questions and things like that. And I'm not sure where it is. Is it?
Downstairs.
Oh, it's downstairs. Okay. So any young people here who'd like to go into a room for as long as you like, really, you know, it's short or as long, quiz. Tish and Sab are going to be there, so just head down there, and then when you've had enough, you can all move out. We'll be having coffee fairly soon. Thanks very much, Tish and Sab. Okay, so next to patients, perhaps the most important voice are parents of patients, and of course, CICRA is partly based on that sort of initiative. So is Natasha here? Here we are. So thanks very much, Natasha, who's going to come and tell us about being a parent.
Thank you. Do I just click that to make it go?
Yes, I think. Or you can use this one.
Oh, there we go.
You can use that forward and back, I think.
Thank you very much. All right.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me? All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, CICRA. I've been calling you CICRA for years, so I do apologise for that. Logan, my son, says he doesn't care. He's going to keep calling you CICRA. My experiences with IBD are quite dynamic. I haven't got IBD myself, so all my experiences are by proxy. Before I go on, I will mention my mum, because I think the experiences I've had with it started with my mum's experiences. I often wonder if she was diagnosed in the 70s. She was in her late teens, and her late great surgeon, Dr. Luck, who basically saved her life and mine, had said he really suspected she had it for at least a decade before she was diagnosed. She was very, very poorly with something else and happened to have been diagnosed while her ovarian cyst had burst. And it was found that actually right next to the bowel that she had Crohn's disease all along, and she wasn't making the symptoms up. She was very, very, very ill. Fast forward to now, she has only part of her large intestine intact, only some of her small intestine intact, but she's extremely well and has been better than ever. Her Crohn's has been dormant for years. So thanks to all the medications that she's been on and the journey that she's been on, which has been harrowing for her. And me as a child, to see her going through all that. One of her resections was done while she was pregnant with me, and apparently it's a miracle that both of us survived. The worst thing I saw was when I was 12 and she went into hospital. No, when I was 6, she was with me. She'd had all the extra symptoms associated, not all of them, but she'd had cardiovascular disease associated with Crohn's. So I was with her one night as a 6-year-old, and she was feeling very out of breath. Went downstairs and she said, "Get Grandpa." And for goodness, I was living with my grandparents as well at the time. And she collapsed, and I didn't think unwell, I just thought dead. So I was in shock. She'd had pulmonary embolisms, and quite a number of them. And she only has one lung that works now. She had another resection done later on, a few years later when I was 12, in hospital for 3 months. Went down from 8 stone to about 5 stone. And she was very, very, very poorly. I mean, she's quite lucky to be alive today. I often wonder if the disease trajectory that my mum had would have been very difficult had we'd known more about it at the time. So another thing I've experienced as a dietitian, I'm not a gastro-dietitian, I'm a general dietitian, but I've seen a lot of adult patients in my clinic with Crohn's and colitis and given them some advice which has actually helped. And the third set of experiences I've had are with my son. That's what this is all about. So, symptoms and diagnosis. So Logan, going back to 2020, Logan was 5, going on 6, and he got COVID. He didn't have many lung symptoms, like he wasn't breathing badly, he just seemed to have a really nasty cold, but he was vomiting a lot. About 2 months later, he started to develop some bowel bleeding, very slight. Now, Logan wasn't diagnosed then, but I suspected he had autism and ADHD from a very, very young age. And with autism, one thing I would say is the best way to describe it is certain elements of your personality dialed up and certain elements of your personality dialed down. And with Logan, he's blessed him in the nicest possible way. he's always been quite a perfectionist, so that and his autism has been dialed up. And any sort of symptoms, any sort of illnesses, he described sometimes as making him feel like he's faulty, and that wasn't right. So, and especially for a child going to school, what was being masked? You know, how ill was he feeling? And I describe Logan as a force of nature, and anyone who gets to know him will describe him in the same way. So, a child with rectal bleeding, alternating constipation with diarrhea for a couple of weeks, and me as a dietitian clinically knowing a bit more than I think the lay public, which is fair enough, and knowing what my mother has had to go through, with abdominal pain that only presented after he'd passed emotion, not beforehand, afterwards, and quite bad pain. With some mouth ulcers as well, I thought, he's not drinking brilliantly at school. Is this constipation? We'll go to the GP and we need to find out what's going on. There wasn't a lot of bleeding. GP was very good, prescribed him lactulose, so let's just keep an eye on this. Christmas Day came a few weeks later, and I thought, well, it's not gotten that bad. It's sort of getting a bit better. Maybe things are helping. And then, oh no, quite a lot of blood Christmas afternoon. I thought, this isn't right. This isn't constipation. This is definitely not. So I phoned him up as soon as the GP surgery was open again. I phoned him up and said, this isn't right. And he said, no, you're right. Go to A&E. So, stupidly, I didn't take him to the Children's Hospital in Birmingham. I went to the hospital my husband and I both work in. It was just closer. And I thought, well, they're going to do the right thing. They're going to know what to do, right? I was concerned. I got through about 4 doctors in our hospital journey over the 3 hours that we were there. I wasn't taken seriously. No, he's got constipation. I said, no, he hasn't. The GP has referred us in because he hasn't got constipation. Right? These symptoms are not synonymous with constipation. School had been on the case for the 2 weeks prior to that. No, we're checking his water. We're making sure he drinks a bit more. He's eating generally quite well. There's no reason we would suspect constipation. This wasn't constipation. No, they said, we'll see. If you get any stools, we'll have a look at it. I said, okay. So Logan did do his business in a nice big pot. And, of course, I walked around the board. It's just chaos in there. It was chaos. But I did give it to an HCA and say, look, healthcare assistant, can you make sure this gets tested, please? Because the doctor's like, no, we'll see you later. So there was me with a pot of poo, but looked very much not like constipation, normal stool, normal colour, not pale, nothing like that, but blood wrapped around the stool. Big, mucousy, red ring around it. I mean, all wrapped around the whole thing. Now that to me is not constipation. Again, of course that stool was never looked at. 4 doctors later, with all the safeguarding questions right, can you tell me honestly, has anything been inserted into his rectum? Nothing's been inserted in his rectum. I've not caused this problem. What do you want to do? You're a dietitian. Was the most helpful doctor asking that question. I said, well, I would like to test him for celiac disease. That's quite a simple blood test to do. Some serology, it's quite easy to do. I would also like some ESR, like the stool calprotectin done. I would like, obviously, LFTs to be done as well as... No, not just CRP, I want the ESR done. I want to know because we've got a strong family history. Okay, so I actually agree with all that. But he wasn't the one arranging tests. A few doctors later, we saw a consultant who said, right, we've been here several hours by this point, and I've been asked over and over and over again. And this doctor, bless her, just said, no, I'm afraid it's constipation. Head, brick wall, no, it's not constipation. Please take me seriously. Logan did another stool, but she said, look, it's a little bit cracked. I said, it's not constipation, though. I've seen... She said, no, that's constipation. You need to go home. It's fine. Blood tests came back. We had a look at them. No ESR. Calprotectin was a bit high. LFTs were a little bit raised. But nothing to be too concerned about. ESR was raised. But no, we're not going to look at it. I said, okay. What should we do? We'll give you an appointment in about 6 months' time. So we went through the next 6 months with it getting worse and worse and worse. And we sent emails in to the secretary of the general paediatrician consultant, and we said, look, these are the pictures of his stools. This isn't constipation. This is only happening when it's diarrhea, and it's awful. And there's blood, and he's got mouth ulcers. I'm a dietitian, so right, I'm not going to tell anyone to go home and do what I've done because I was a clinical dietitian. I knew what I was doing. I was fortifying his diet. I was buying Floridix, an iron supplement you can get to children over the counter. I wasn't going to not do that just to prove somebody else right or wrong. I was going to do what I could to nourish my child, because suddenly he wasn't really growing properly. He was lethargic. He was upset. He was in pain. He didn't look right. And I just, being Logan, wanting to mask, not because he's bad, but because he wants to be right. Because that zest for life that this child has is incredible. He was absolutely remarkable. He wouldn't complain. He'd just go, oh, I'm in pain, Mum. I want to go and play rugby. I want to go and play, I want to go and play cricket. I want to go throw a ball. Throw a ball with me. Oh, I'm in pain. I just want to go ahead and live my life. I want to go and play with my friends. He didn't want to let anything get in his way. But of course, I was bringing the ONS, there stands for Oral Nutrition Support, and I was bringing some things home from my job, from my community job, for him to try that was safe, that were, knew what I was doing. And sometimes I would give him these things and say, let's have a trial. Let's see what we can do. And I was making my own milkshakes with high protein, milk and yogurt and frozen avocado, lots of, healthy things, ground nuts. That probably was helping him to not lose too much weight, but it was masking things a bit. But I was being clear with the doctors. I am doing this. It's having some effect, but he's not getting better. We got a generic letter back after all the emails we'd sent and just pleading, can you please expedite his next appointment? Well, we can't wait 6 months. No, it's fine. So we took him to A&E again, same hospital. And because he'd had a lot more bleeding. And they'd done another repeat test a few weeks before then, and we'd had no response. And we rang them up and said, we'll bring him into you, but can you tell us what these blood results were? And they said, well, actually, they're a bit raised. LFTs everything was raised, really quite raised. His liver function tests were in the hundreds. The hundreds. That's not mildly raised. That was excruciatingly high. I let Logan sit with his dad for a little bit, and I went off and I had a massive cry. And I thought, this isn't just IBD, is it? Because my mother had never had LFTs like this. This is awful. What did I do while he was taken to hospital by my husband? I Googled it. I thought, wish someone had told me not to do that, because my suspicions were unfortunately correct months later. And I thought, he's got primary sclerosing cholangitis as well as IBD, hasn't he? And this is awful. I'm afraid it's very rare. Well, I'm glad it's very rare, but I'm afraid that he had it. But at this stage, I can only suspect, and I had months later, to another 3-4 months before he was diagnosed with both things properly. So he went into A&E again, and again, they didn't really do anything. Oh, we'll see you in a few weeks. I said, but what for? We can't scope him here. But surely you can now refer him to the children's. You can't wait for the answer to fall from the sky. This boy's poorly. No. We'll see you in a few weeks. So a few weeks later, we went to the clinic, and they said, okay, we're going to refer you now. No new information. All the information had been the same through the hospital journey. So we finally went to the Children's Hospital. They had the reports within a week. We were rung up within a few days of them receiving the reports. We were given an appointment about a week later for scopes. We went in for the pre-scopes chat with her, and she said, look, you're a dietitian, fine. Whatever works for him, you ring us up, we'll prescribe it. You know what you're doing, it's fine. I said, well, he doesn't like the supplements anyway. So I'm making my own sort of thing at home, and it's fine. Normal foods. You don't have to go to Narnia to get any of these things, just normal foods, but I was putting them together. A week later, we got a phone call from the liver consultant. We were warned we might get a phone call from them because they did say, look, the liver function tests they're terrible. Having been told by the previous hospital that they were just mildly raised and nothing to worry about. So we did then get the scopes done, but a few days before the scopes, the liver consultant, the hepatologist gave me a ring and said, right, we suspect we're going to have to test for autoimmune hepatitis as well as primary sclerosing cholangitis because we've seen the liver function tests and they're pretty high, Mum. I said, yeah, I know what you're suspecting. I've been suspecting this for 4 months now. This was just before his birthday, a few weeks before his 7th birthday. And she went through things with me and gained consent to do along with the scopes, to have a liver biopsy as well. So we did that. And I said, look, are you doing these liver liver biopsies to rule things out, or are you doing it to confirm? And I'd hit my heart. You know, when you go to an elevator and you suddenly whoosh down and your stomach sort of comes up and you think you're going to throw it all up. I felt like that when she said, no, Mum, I really suspect he might actually have both. I said, oh, okay, thank you for telling me that. I'm glad you've been clear. We'll look forward to the results to get this out of my mind. And of course, I've been Googling this, hadn't I? The worst thing you can do. And she didn't tell me not to Google it, so I carried on Googling it. And what do I see on Google? Really old papers on primary sclerosing cholangitis about, you know, often enough people don't have a great time without a liver transplant within a few years. And I'm thinking, he's 6. This is awful. So I went into a corner of the room and howled for a bit. Said, and again, Neil, can you just look after Logan for a bit? Well, I've been screamed into a pillow. I was so worried. And seeing how my mum had gone through her journey with Crohn's, I was obviously quite concerned. And I'd seen patients who hadn't done very well. And I was a bit kind of, I wish ignorance had been a blissful, wonderful thing, but I wasn't in that position. So he had his scopes, endoscopy, colonoscopy, all the biopsies, so gut and liver. He came out of everything fine. He was brilliant. But while he was coming around, the response from the gastroenterologist was hilarious. She came out going, where's Mum? Where's Mum? And I was like, oh, I'm here. She came over and she said, he's poorly. I said, I know. She said, no, he's poorly. He's poorly. I said, yeah, I know. Is he going to be all right, though? She said, no, he's going to be fine. He's poorly, all right? I've never seen so many ulcers in a large intestine in a child that age ever. I said, oh, okay. She was really poorly. So he had a lot of steroids. And he had tapered down for 9 weeks. He had mesalazine. And then 2 weeks later, we got the diagnosis. I was at work at the time, and I said, should you even be? I said, yeah, I'm fine. I'll sit at home. I'll just mither. So I went in, and the consultant phoned me, and I said, oh, just excuse me. I just got to step out of the clinic for a bit. So I spoke to the consultant. She said, yeah, he has got primary sclerosing cholangitis. If anyone doesn't know what that is, it is very rare. Most people with primary sclerosingitis already have a form of IBD, but they're usually adults when they get the diagnosis. But I think more and more it's being investigated at the same time as IBD, from what the hepatologist tells me anyway. And he started on ursodeoxycholic acid, which just helps the bile move through the body, because primary sclerosing cholangitis is characterised by bile ducts that get quite scarred, and therefore bile doesn't get moved through properly. And some people can look very jaundiced. And with it, Logan has never been jaundiced. He's been absolutely fine. So all his liver scans were normal afterwards. All his symptoms went within about 2 days of starting the steroid treatment. We went on holiday a couple of weeks afterwards, and he was gaining weight. He was feeling fantastic. We were told we wouldn't be able to keep up with his appetite. Finally, he was actually eating more than we'd ever expected in our lives. We were on holiday and we kept going out to find more food for him because we hadn't stocked the car up enough. It was incredible. He was brilliant. He's only had a couple of minor flares, but with azathioprine, he has had problems where we might as a family have all caught colds, and he's ended up in hospital with pneumonia, but dealt with very quickly, and antibiotics have been a brilliant thing for him. He's had 3 monthly reviews with gastro team, 6 monthly reviews with hepatology, and they've just moved it to a year because his liver scans are all normal. So there's been no progression with that at all, which is absolutely marvellous. Really, really proud of that. As a dietitian, I sort of, do focus on the gut. We were told a lot of the time we suspect, but we don't know, that if you keep the gut healthy, then the liver stays healthy. So I've sort of done, with Logan, we worked out that actually lactose, it doesn't work with everybody. We worked out with a lot of lactose. High animal fats don't work for him. He has lean meats. He can't cope with we're told just whack the calories in. Well, as a dietitian, I know there's lots of ways to skin a cat, so lots of ways to put calories in. So I give him lots of very simple sugars. He has fruits, he has honey, he doesn't have a lot of lactose. We find that tends to flare him up a little bit. A lot of wheat tends to do the same things. We tend to vary his diet, but what I'd say to anyone, regardless of any disease, is if you can possibly manage it, get as big a variety of foods as you possibly can. That's going to be the best way to harness, like casting a huge net. The bigger the net, bigger the variety of your grains and cereals and vegetables and fruits and lean meats or pulses, the bigger the nutrition status is going to be. He does really quite well on yogurt and kombucha. He doesn't suddenly like as a child, oh, I don't like yogurt. He's loved it for ages, and then next week when you bought a kilo of the stuff, he's, I hate that. I'm not eating it. So then I went and bought kombucha. My mum, however, has noticed a huge improvement in her gut since she started taking kombucha. Honestly, she drinks it almost every day, and I've never felt better. And it's the one thing that's different. I'm not saying that is the thing, I'm just saying that's what we've done with her, and she seems to have helped. She's also followed the sort of steps that I've given Logan. It's brilliant. So I give him prebiotics like garlic in his food, his bananas, I add a little bit of turmeric to things. Nothing, again, no super foods, nothing you can't get from a normal supermarket. He has multivitamins, vitamin D every day. He has high protein foods that are quite lean, eggs, pulses, nuts, seeds, fish. Rapeseed oil is naturally high in omega-3, so I make sure I cook with that, not any other kind of oil. Walnuts are naturally high in omega-3. He loves them, so I shove them on his plate for breakfast until he says to me one day, I don't like these anymore, and I have to find ways of sneaking them in. Ground them down, put them on his Weetabix. He doesn't even know they're there sometimes. So he will now. So he does, he's going to hate me now. Hate you, Mum. But we've worked out what works for him. We've been very, very lucky. He's not been hospitalised with IBD or PSC at all, so we have been extremely lucky. But the fact that the medications, I mean, with a few days of having those medications, everything was ameliorated. It's been incredible, absolutely incredible. And I do keep having to say to Logan, we know you've got autism, we know you want to be perfect, it doesn't exist. I don't want you to hide things. If you're feeling ill, you've got to tell us, We're not going to worry. And you have to be a bit of an actor as a parent. You have to sort of pretend you're not worried inside. You say to the children, I am worried, but it's not going to affect my life. You know, we just need to tell me. You can't hide things because that's when problems will happen. And Logan knows that one day he may need a new liver. He may need one, but he might not. And I think that's the problem as a parent, is that unpredictability. That sort of, he might wake up tomorrow and be quite poorly, and I won't know what to do, apart from to speak to the professionals of the team. The overall relief that we had when he was finally diagnosed, the frustration was awful for us throughout the hospital journey, because we kept thinking, well, they're going to do the right thing, surely. They're going to refer him, surely. And I'm guilty to this day, thinking, why didn't we just take him to the Children's Hospital to start with? But it's because I had faith that General Hospital were going to do the right thing. They hadn't tested his bloods properly. They had not disproved nor proved anything from those first tests. They had not counted the fact that I had fortified his foods, that I had made a difference, but that I've been clear about that. Like, without this, his growth would be worse. Possibly his trajectory of the disease might have been, I don't know, what would have been like. Drugs don't do everything, diet doesn't do everything. I think you need a combination. Another impact we had was Logan. I went to A&E about a year ago. I was poorly with something, and Logan said, I want to accompany you. I said, you can't stay in A&E. You can take me there with Dad, but you need to then, leave me there. And he was crying his eyes out. And I said, what's wrong, Dad? I'm going to be fine. I was, eventually. But he said, well, I remember having my tests. Poor thing. He remembers the bowel prep for the 2 days beforehand. He remembers feeling so ill. He said he remembered feeling awful having those tests done. He was really actually very scared. And he didn't look that scared. But that's Logan. He didn't want to seem to be not coping. And so he said he got flashbacks. He goes for his test quite regularly. He can sit on his own. He doesn't need a tourniquet. He just has his bloods done. I said, there's nothing to worry about. I'm not going to overreact. You're just going to, everyone does this every few months with your diseases. And my mum was able to say, look, hopefully your disease won't go the way that mine did, because you've been treated with things very early on, and we're different people, and you never know how you're going to react and how different your journey will be. He was too young for EPALs at the time, but actually, because he's so stable and because he's been okay, we haven't really needed it. But we've been very grateful for the support we had from CICRA. We're glad to have had all the updates and the newsletters and things. And I've done I've done an awful lot of fundraising. So for PSC, I did the 3 Peaks Challenge last year, and people were very generous, and we raised £2,300. Crohn's and Colitis UK, I've done an event for just now, a 60-mile running in September, which my Achilles is never going to forgive me for. And then we did a family event in April. We did an inflatable 5K run. Not that challenging for my husband and I, but for Logan, who got quite emotional about it, and was really proud. I'm well enough to do this today. And he ran that 5K with inflatable obstacles faster than most parents, most adults there. It was incredible. He's really well. And currently, he's doing the under-10s county cricket trials in Warwickshire. So if he'd been like this exactly now, 3 years ago, he wouldn't be doing it. He wouldn't. He was very, very poorly. And I often think I have no idea how we would have managed and how he would have been without those medications working so well. So I'm more than grateful to the medical teams and all the research that is done, because it has basically kept our son probably alive. His liver was not in a good state. So I am very, very pleased that we've not had a transplant, and thank you to CICRA and all the medical teams that really help us out. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. That's very moving. I always find it difficult when you see the difficulties getting the diagnosis. I was involved in a NHS initiative a few years ago, which is basically advising GPs. If you see an adult or a child who you haven't seen before, and they've got something wrong with their tummy, pain or blood or whatever, you send some blood, you send a calprotectin. If they're abnormal, you go to the specialist to get diagnosed. And that's within a month or 6 weeks is the expectation. So it's very disappointing that didn't happen with Logan there. We're going to juggle the order a little bit, so everyone, we'll give everyone a break now to go and grab some coffee or tea or whatever, go to the bathroom and buy some CICRA raffle tickets or kit as well, because it's all out there. So please make the most of the wonderful prizes on offer. Don't miss out. We'll give you 20 minutes for all of that, please. So that's 3 o'clock back here. All right, thank you everyone. Okay, I think we're core 8. I'm sure some more will drift in and take their seats. Hope you had a nice coffee and bought your raffle tickets. And our next speaker, hopefully he's going to come in a sec, is my friend and colleague Mark Gasparetto, who's at Norfolk and Norwich. And he's going to update us what's happening in the world of IBD research. And that's quite a big topic, actually. So I'm looking forward to seeing how he squeezes that into 20 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to CICRA and Medicine and Me for inviting me here today. I'm giving a talk about research, and those who know me know how much this matters to me and how much it's been part of my daily work throughout my career so far. I haven't got specific conflicts of interest for this presentation. Maybe I should just mention that our team recently joined a clinical trial sponsored by AbbVie that allow us to use upadacitinib, that is as a JAK-STAT inhibitor for children with Crohn's disease. But I don't think this will affect what I'm going to say today anyway. And in terms of the content, as Professor Croft said, research in IBD is broad, so I can't cover everything in 20 minutes, but I thought I would give you some examples of meaningful research endeavors that are happening in the UK at present. And so I'll be talking about genomics in PIBD research, about epigenetics in PIBD research. I will also mention clinical trials. There will be one slide, and I promise it's only one slide, about myself, like my background, where I'm from, what I've done so far. But it's just to give you some perspective at the angle of this presentation. It will not be more than one. So this is me. I'm originally from the northeast of Italy. It's a city called Padua, not far from Venice. It's the second oldest university in Italy. And I went to medical school there, started training in pediatrics there. But then I moved to Cambridge in 2013, and in Cambridge I completed my training in pediatrics. Cambridge is probably where I became a paediatric gastroenterologist. I was a CICRA fellow between 2015 and 2018. And as a CICRA fellow, I undertook a research project. With that project, I successfully applied for a postgrad doctorate degree at Cambridge University. I then completed the CICRA fellowship and the degree, and my first consultant job was at the Royal London Hospital with Professor Croft, Dr. Deb, and the rest of the team who are here today. I was there for a few years. I was still research active in those years, and then 2 years ago I moved to the Norfolk and Norwich, where I'm working now. This position allows me to be a consultant in pediatric gastroenterology for 80% of my time, and the 20% of my time is protected for research and allows me to continue being research active. So why are people like me, but also most of the faculty involved here today, interested and passionate about research in pediatric inflammatory bowel disease? Well, most of us being also, or primarily clinicians as well, I guess the main reason is that we care about our patients, and we see young persons and children struggle with IBD around the time of diagnosis or later on when they go through a difficult flare, for example. And we all feel the mission of offering the children and the young persons a better care, better options, better treatments. From a more scientific point of view, it is very interesting research that we undertake, because if we think about the last decade, for example, there's so much more that we've been able to understand about what underlies IBD, what are the mechanisms behind IBD, but we don't understand it all. So we are not in a situation like the figure on the left, where all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzles are all over the place, but we are sadly not yet in a situation like the figure on the right, where we know exactly what causes the condition or how to cure the condition. There is no cure at the moment, but there is an increasing number of treatments, as Jochen just showed us earlier. We are somewhere in the middle. We understand that genetics plays an important role in IBD, but it may not explain the entirety of the cases we see. We understand that the environment is very important, but we don't know exactly how it triggers or it contributes to IBD. There's lots of research ongoing into epigenetics, which is mechanisms that make our genes switch on or off, and the environment might mediate that process. Of course, mechanisms around the intestinal barrier function. So if our intestine is leaking, that might drive to chronic inflammation and inflammatory bowel disease. And of course, IBD is an immune-mediated condition, and most of the treatments we are using today target the immune system, so that's also a very important part of the picture. Another element is that we are seeing young persons and children with IBD more and more often. You can see the graph on the left. The red part of the graph is last century, and the countries that went through industrialization or westernization saw a sharp peak of IBD cases, and the blue part of the graph, more on the right, shows this century, and exactly the same is happening in countries that are now industrializing and adopting and westernized lifestyle. So cases are more and more, and if we look at the table with one of the latest worldwide pediatric epidemiology study, this is from Canada, but if we look at Western Europe, we see that 1 in 2,000 children at the moment are affected from IBD. So when I went to medical school, and that is sadly more than 20 years ago, I was told that IBD was rare, but I wouldn't say IBD is rare nowadays. It's actually being seen more and more often. So the epidemiology is changing rapidly. And talking about research and epidemiology, this is a friend and colleague of ours, Dr. Paul Henderson, is based in Edinburgh, and he recently undertook a massive research study where basically he managed to get in touch with every single pediatric gastroenterology unit across the UK, and basically to count the number of children and young persons diagnosed with IBD during a specific time period. And what this provided us with is a new sort of updated data on incidence and prevalence of IBD in children. So we now know exactly how many children are affected from IBD in the UK. The previous time this had been done was in 1999, so it was about time to redo this exercise. And now we know that we are seeing 12 new cases per 100,000 children per year in the UK. And we know that in terms of prevalence, so the actual numbers of patients in the pediatric age is 50 in 100,000. That's the 1 in 2,000 I just mentioned earlier. So not a small prevalence anymore. What is the challenge around performing research in IBD? One of the challenges is that IBD is very heterogeneous, so every child tends to be different from our children, although the condition is defined as IBD. We know that when we speak about Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, we are oversimplifying things. Crohn's and ulcerative colitis are probably two ends of a spectrum, and the total number of the patients we see falls somewhere within the spectrum. So, each and every child is not the same as another patient. It is absolutely possible to group our patients because there are some similarities, some similar characteristics, but they're not all the same. So what scientists and researchers are doing these days to try and tackle the heterogeneity of IBD is to use a multi-omics approach. So they're looking into different layers of information sort of separately or in parallel. So they're looking into genetics, epigenetics, proteomics, metabolomics, the microbiota, and other layers. And each of these layers will give you lots of data, lots of numbers, these large data sets. And the challenge is how to match this huge amount of information from each of these layers with the actual children, patients. So with the clinical variables, how do the children present a diagnosis? How do they do during the disease course? Do they need surgery? Do they respond to that biologic or to the other medicine? So it's a matching of these several big data sets with the clinical characteristics that is challenging. And Zachary's project as a CICRA fellow will be partly around trying to match some of the layers with the clinical information, and sort of new technologies like AI will definitely help us in this respect. But what this could make possible for the near future is to identify what we call diagnostic or prognostic biomarkers. What is this? It's like parameters that can really help us diagnose IBD more specifically. So ideally, on a molecular level, to be able to say, okay, that child has got this type of IBD. It's not just Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. It's got this specific type of IBD, and therefore it needs this specific treatment. So to try and personalize medicine in IBD. So what is precision medicine in IBD? Is being able to tailor the right therapy to the right patient at the right time based on the patient's individual biology. So instead of applying the same international protocol to each and every child, to personalize or at least group our children in a more sort of accurate, specific way. We are not there yet. We haven't achieved precision medicine in IBD. And sometimes I do wonder whether Beryl Bernard Crohn, who first described a Crohn's terminal ileitis back in 1932, I wonder whether he would be satisfied or not with all these mechanisms and pathways that we understand contribute to Crohn's disease, or whether he would be a bit disappointed that we haven't really identified one single mechanism that explains it all. So we haven't identified a cure yet. But whenever I feel a bit stuck or unhappy with the progress in research in IBD, I normally look at this figure. And this is a timeline showing you the new treatments that have been introduced to treat IBD since 1999 to the present day. And you can see the explosion of new advanced therapies that we've had around 2020, 2022. We've got so many new biologics, so many new treatments. But like Jochen said previously, this doesn't mean that we can easily use them all, particularly in the pediatric population. This is where clinical trials come into discussion, and we possibly will have a discussion during the question and answer panel about where we are with clinical trials in pediatric IBD at the moment. Now, just to mention some of the big research endeavors that are happening in the UK at the moment, and going back to this multi-omics kind of approach that we are using, this is an important example. This is the PIBD Bioresource National project. It's got an adult part and a pediatric part. The pediatric part is led by Professor Holm Oleg in Oxford, who's here with us today. And the main focus or aim of this project is to perform genetic analysis to identify markers of disease risk, severity, and treatment response in children with IBD. And it's basically a nationwide biobank project. Some of you families attending today might have contributed to the PIBD bioresource already, but it's many of us, the majority of the pediatric gastroenterology units in the UK are contributing towards the PIBD bioresource. And this is an example of how important it is that we all work together, because the more samples, the more data, the more accurate the findings, and the more powerful the research we undertake. And if we move from one layer to another layer, so from genomics to epigenetics, this is Marcel Bauer, with whom I've collaborated for many, many years. He was my supervisor during my PhD in Cambridge, and he's always had this interest in epigenetics in IBD. So when I went to Cambridge in 2013 as a fellow and as a PhD student, I saw this TRAPE research protocol basically being born in Cambridge. It means translational research in intestinal physiology and pathology. The meaning is that basically the team are allowed to recruit children into this research protocol when children need gastrointestinal endoscopies for clinical reasons. They will donate some intestinal biopsies. And they can also collect blood samples and stool samples. And of course, they will have information, data from these samples, this tissue that they collect, and then they match the data with the clinical information as we just discussed. And when I then moved to Norwich 2 years ago, I was able to set up the TRAPE research protocol in Norwich. So this biobank was no longer just a single center in Cambridge, but it was a regional biobank between Cambridge and Norwich. And more recently, 2 centers in Italy, in Naples, have joined the biobank. 1 center in Hungary and 2 centers in Germany have joined as well. So it's become from single center to international. The aim is to work around this molecular profiles of cells or tissues that are relevant to IBD and other gastrointestinal conditions, to investigate possible diagnostic and prognostic biomarkers that we have mentioned, but it is also possible to study the healthy intestinal lining or epithelium and compare different age categories and see how the intestine evolves from an infant to a young child to an older child, or to grow mini guts in the laboratory. So starting from the stem cells that are situated between the villi, we can generate models of mini bowels in vitro, and that allows us to perform experiments and functional assays to prove correlations that we find when we do our big data analysis in the first instance. So this is the paper that generated from my CICRA fellowship. This was back in 2019, and I was looking at a parameter in specific lymphocytes, so cells that we separated out from peripheral blood taken from children with IBD, and whether that could correlate with the disease characteristics, the disease course. And if we jump in time and we go to August 2024, this is the latest paper from the same research network, that is the TRAPE research study protocol. But you can see from the number of authors that this also includes Norwich, Italy, Germany, Hungary. So things have become bigger, and this is another epigenetic finding that we recently shared and published. And moving from inside the cells to outside the cells, of course, the environment we mentioned is very important. The immune system is very important in the pathogenesis of IBD. And this is a very important project called the PIBD Inception Cohort Study. Professor Nick Croft has been one of the main initiators of this, definitely on the UK side, but it extends over to Europe, other European countries as well. And the aim is to prospectively recruit children from different countries and to follow them up for 20 years, to very carefully analyze their environmental exposures, but to also perform a set of analyses looking at their immune responses or the immune system. So it's another, layer of those multi-omics layers we mentioned earlier that will really help us understand exactly what contributes to IBD and what is in the picture. Of course, I could never not mention the microbiota. In the audience, we've got colleagues who are very experienced in microbiota research, Professor Sanderson, Dr. Deb, and others. This is something that I'm doing locally at the Norfolk Norwich at the moment. I'm collaborating with Professor Juge, who I think is looking into something that I didn't know much before I moved to Norwich, but she's interested in something called mucin glycosylation. So basically our lining, our epithelium, is covered by mucus, and this mucus will have some sugar molecules, and this can be profiled, so we can look at the composition of these sugar molecules in the mucus, and you can see whether this changes between inflammatory bowel disease and healthy children, and whether this also changes the bugs, the microbiota that are residing in the bowel. So it's another example of translational research, so from the patient to the laboratory back to the patient, that I'm currently involved with. Like we said, the term research is broad. Research in IBD is broad. I only chatted with you about translational research studies today, but clinical trials are equally important. These are studies that allow us to test the efficacy and the tolerance of new treatments in children with inflammatory bowel disease. And this has been mentioned by Jochen already, but we are struggling with a few aspects here, and one aspect in particular is the time lag between adult approval of new advanced therapies and child approval. The process is too long, and it doesn't allow us to be able to offer our children new treatments that we know can be efficacious and safe timely, because we're simply not allowed to do it. So Nick Croft has advocated for a shorter time duration between adult and pediatric approval for some time. And this is another colleague of ours, Professor Turner in Israel. He recently led the Porto IBD working group of ESPGHAN. ESPGHAN is a European Society of Pediatric Gastroenterology. So we wrote a letter to the FDA, to the Food and Drug Administration, to basically raise what we think could work better in the area of clinical trials for children with IBD, and how we could be able to tackle that time lag between adult and pediatric approvals. Just let you know that things are hopefully evolving, fingers crossed. This is my conclusion slide to say there is, of course, a lot that we get from research and is relevant to children with IBD and their families. Something that I haven't mentioned, but I hope was implied throughout the presentation, is the importance of the families and the children themselves. So PPI, patient and public involvement, is something we are seeing more and more when we sit around our tables to discuss research studies. So to have a young person, to have a family there telling us whether that study is felt relevant to them, whether the study design is doable, feasible for a child or a young person, to have their voice is really important, and this is happening now, way more than it was happening 10 years ago, for example, and we are delighted to see that. Where I see the future is hopefully a future where research studies like the pinpoint epidemiology, but also the PIBD bioresource, the TRIP research study protocol, the PIBD inception cohort, ideally they could sort of run together, nationwide. There could be a structure that allow us to investigate its layers of information all together. We are heading that way because we are collaborating among different centers already. But I think, the more we are, the more relevant data we obtain and the more accurate findings we achieve. And this is a thank you for all the institutions and organizations who helped me and supported me throughout the journey. My nurses, they're amazing, and they are always running around seeing families and children, bringing biopsies from one side to the other of the hospital. I couldn't do anything without nurse support. And thank you to all of you for listening today. Thank you.
Marco, we've got a question and answer session coming up, so I think we'll save question and answer. Just one question for the audience says, how many people have been invited to be part of a research study in whatever setting? Do you want to stick your hands up? We've got, say, 4 or 5 maybe, 6. Yeah, so I mean the aim is to have as many people involved, because sometimes families worry they're being experimented on when you talk about research, but that's not the case. Often all we need is that the ability to access your information and your patient and your child's information, your data, but we still have to get consent for that. So, so I just encourage you to at least listen if someone asks you, and if you decide not to, that's fine. Thanks very much, Marco. Save your questions for question and answers after our next speaker, who is Kate Blakely, who's a old friend, consultant paediatric clinical psychologist. Lots and lots of experience of young patients with inflammatory bowel disease.
Thank you, Nick. I'm hoping you can actually see me over the top of here. As Nick said, I worked with the team at the Royal London for a very, very long time as the clinical psychologist, particularly working with patients with IBD. What I would say before I go into what I'm going to talk about, I'm very aware from having done CICRA family meetings over the years that the availability of psychology spreads from absolutely zero to quite amazing resources in some places. So I'm kind of aware that some people will be very, very aware of what we do and other people will not really have a clue. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction just generally, and then just talk a bit about what I did as part of my role at the team of the Royal London. So, and I'll be part of the panel and around later if people have any questions. So first of all, for those of you who don't know, a paediatric psychologist in the NHS is pretty much always someone who's trained as a clinical psychologist and specialised in working with children who have physical health problems and medical diagnoses. And our sort of sweet point, if you like, a sweet spot, if you like, is the interaction between someone's mental health and their physical health. And a lot of the time, not all of the time necessarily, for the children and teenagers that I saw with inflammatory bowel disease, it very much started with physical health symptoms, a diagnosis, and then the very much significant effect that had on their emotional well-being and functioning. So that would be the way it would normally be presented. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We usually work in children's hospitals or wards with the medical teams and as part of the multidisciplinary team. I think that's incredibly important. We need to be part of a team. We need to learn about what everybody else on the team does and contribute to conversations and learn about what other people do, so it all comes together as being what should be very holistic care. And many paediatric clinical psychologists, such as myself, specialise further in working with particular medical conditions such as diabetes, sickle cell disease or inflammatory bowel disease, which is what we're here to talk about today. And generally, the hope is, the advantage is that we actually understand a lot more about how the conditions are diagnosed, the process, or sometimes the route of diagnosis, how the condition's treated, what investigations are involved in the medications are used. So we have, it's something that, so you don't have to explain to us about all this sort of stuff. We actually have a good grounding in that and also can go to our teams to get more information rather than using parents and children as intermediaries. Most clinical psychologists who work as paediatric psychologists will work on an inpatient and an outpatient basis. So we'll work on the wards with the teams, with the nursing teams for children who have been admitted, but also work in outpatient consultations, both co-working. So I would do appointments with dietitians, for example. I'd sit in on medical consultations or sit in with the nurse specialists to see children and families together. But we would also do one-to-one work where there's something more specifically that needs addressing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we also use a combination of what's called psychoeducation, so psychologically informed information about conditions, about medications, about treatments. Different psychologists use different models of psychological therapy. Most people generally heard about CBT or cognitive behavioural therapy. That's generally not something that's used an awful lot, I would say, in paediatric settings, but often more kind of family-based or narrative-based, where you're actually working in a much more of a health and language model. But we do also, because we're trained as mental health professionals, sometimes do part of our job is doing mental health assessments, looking at anxiety, low mood, but also, I think increasingly actually children who have other neurodiversity diagnoses like ADHD and ASD, which may also be complicating their treatment and their management of their condition. Generally, because we're trained working with children and families, we kind of move through the life course. So initially, with very early onset diagnoses, we would be much more working with parents, and then as children get a little bit older, you're working more with the child and the parents, and then gradually more to do with working with adolescents and working towards transition. But we also work with the teams if there are difficulties about any particular situation. And just sort of for information, really, I did a bit of a really crude notes review quite a long time ago. As you say, the age range was 5 years to 17 years. I think actually that if I did it again now, it would be lower as a starting point. And those are the types of reasons that I was asked to see a child or a family. The low mood, just generally adaptation to an illness, and stress and anxiety were the biggest referral reasons. And just to break it down a little bit, probably it's worth saying, I was just talking to one of the parents in the break actually, who was telling me that at the centre they're at, actually every child who is diagnosed with inflammatory bowel disease meets a psychologist and is invited to join sort of an introductory group, for want of a better word. Where at the Royal London, when I worked there, that wasn't the case. It tended to be more around if there were particular difficulties around diagnosis. Also, I guess, depending on the child's age at diagnosis, again, it might be more speaking with parents about the diagnosis, or then later on with an adolescent. But particularly also, I'm just thinking about the early presentation, when diagnosis has taken a really long time, and the child and the family have gone through a very long period of symptoms of being unwell, maybe of being dismissed by other health professionals or being misunderstood. Quite often I would get more involved when actually it had taken a really long time to get a diagnosis, and the parents and the child had just had a really particularly tough time finding an answer and getting a treatment. Often it was fortunate, I guess, that I worked at the Royal London, where they were getting all of that. But again, very, very difficult to wait a long time and to be worried about your child for so long. Sometimes, actually, it would have been about sometimes the attitude of other healthcare professionals, hopefully usually outside of the centre that we worked at. But professionals can be very dismissive sometimes, and actually not listening to parents who know their children very well and feel like they're not being taken seriously, and perhaps things not being expedited as they would have liked them to be. And also just shock around a particular diagnosis, and maybe also a bit of managing a bit of Dr. Google going on, and parents really freaking themselves out with what they're finding on the internet, or children and teenagers doing so. Some of the work we do can be around the type of medication that's being used, just generally spending quite a long time on feeds and drinks, and then the reintroduction of food being, Simeon was talking about not being able to eat lovely Greek food when he was on holiday, and some families manage this really, really well, other families struggle with it, or maybe siblings can be a little cruel, perhaps, around being able to eat what they want to eat when their brother or sister can't. Sometimes it is a bit about working with families, about how that's managed and having a bit of a plan in place. Sometimes things to do with having to have NG tubes being passed, the effect of just having an NG tube when you're trying to drink or eat. Could also sometimes be about side effects of medications. I would say a lot of particularly teenagers, but increasingly younger children, I think are very aware of what they're putting into their bodies and do research into it and actually like to know a lot of information about it. And I think it's also about managing that information appropriately and also having those conversations with the medical professionals if it feels like it's getting a bit stuck. And lastly, but not least, being on steroids, sometimes that might be just about the physical appearance that happens when you've been on quite high doses of steroids for a long time. I know certainly children have sort of said to me how weird it is to look at yourself in a mirror and not look like yourself. Sometimes teasing and things that happens at school. But also, I think sometimes actually when you're weaning off steroids, and have got maybe sort of feel like you're flying a little bit, and actually they're coming down off steroids and coming back to feeling normal and normal levels of energy and maybe still some fatigue. Again, it's just about helping to manage day-to-day life and things like getting back to school and getting back to activities and things. One of the things kind of at the other side of a sort of late diagnosis is when you've got quite extended periods of illness, and one of the often reasons that I would get referrals is actually for, like, the ward might phone up or someone in clinic might say, we're really worried about this young person being depressed. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but actually it's quite difficult when you've got a condition that makes you, you've got pain, you've got fatigue. It really affects your mood anyway, having active Crohn's disease or colitis. But also if you had a long period of illness, you're out of school, you can't do sports, you can't go out with your friends. Sometimes those friendships move on without you, and that can be really tough, and sometimes it's about having conversations about how to manage that and how to re-establish relationships or trusting relationships when you've got something that's really changing your life. Getting back to school or going back to college, and just maybe sometimes doing stuff with the nurse specialist about education with schools, or thinking about how to reintegrate back into school and managing some anxiety around that. Also for some of the children where actually they've been very ill for a very long time, just about physical rehabilitation, about pacing, and sometimes about recovery from surgery, or even thinking about surgery. I've become involved in working with the teams around that. Just very briefly, really, just as I was saying about sometimes I get calls saying we're really worried that this young person is depressed. There are the really delightfully called neurovegetative symptoms of depression, which are actually very difficult to distinguish when you've actually got quite active inflammatory bowel disease. And in fact, I would say more than 9 times out of 10, when a young person's illness started to respond to treatment and to medication, their mood actually started to lift at the same time, and it was relatively rare that it turned out to be depression. It was much more a response to feeling unwell, feeling tired, coping with diagnosis, and actually just being out of their normal life and worrying about getting back to it for a while. There is also sometimes mood and behaviour changes around steroids. Probably more, I would say, with younger children, probably got more involved, just because adolescents are often much more in tune with how the medications are affecting them and can talk about that. But also sometimes managing behaviour when on steroids. And there is it's also sometimes just a little bit of a reminder for me that there is an importance of screening for depression in young people with IBD when they're older at the time of diagnosis or on steroids, because you can get a slightly higher risk of that. How am I doing for time, Professor Croft?
Keep going.
Okay. Just a little bit more about working with teenagers. Unsurprisingly, my intervention certainly, and I think generally the team would say actually you more and more increase your intervention to being with the adolescent themselves, and just the balance of power, a transfer of responsibility, and sometimes that can be quite difficult for parents. They've been doing an amazing job at supporting their child, looking after them. They've been very vulnerable, and actually for that sort of teenage stuff to start kicking in and independence to start kicking in can be really hard when you've had a very sick adolescent around. Sometimes there can be discussions about medications and treatments and things, and actually conversations about what the adolescent's priorities are. Sometimes that might be with the team, sometimes that might be more individually, particularly maybe if there's a bit of conflict going on within the family about what parents might want and what the young person might want, and just about facilitating a bit of negotiation around how to make decisions for a young person who's moving into young adult care. And sometimes, particularly with medications, a question can be kind of the amount of effort you have to put in. How much better can someone expect to feel? It's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis, if you like. Again, things like broader things like life goals, prognosis. I think that's always a difficult one with when you're dealing with IBD. It's not always the most predictable of conditions to manage. And I think just speaking to a lot of parents over the years with CICRA, I think often that's a big difficulty of planning and how to move things forward. And actually, again, that idea of independence for teenagers and moving on when you have parents who are, wanting to make sure they're all right and they're well and they keep well and they keep taking their medications and things. Things about who to share information with, peer relationships, especially if there's been a bit of loss of those relationships over a period of illness. Telling people about your inflammatory bowel disease is not always easy. And I've often had conversations, particularly with teenagers, about how to start sharing information and who, and you don't have to tell everybody everything all at the same time. You can start off with a small amount of information and take it from there. And also things like as teenagers get older and maybe want to forget about the fact that they have inflammatory bowel disease and maybe don't want to take the medication in the way that would be desired by the team or by their parents, and what that might mean. It's those conversations about adherence to medication and actually, who can accept what as a balance of what's going on. There is a little bit of a developmental task of adolescence. There is about someone's personal identity growing up with inflammatory bowel disease. And I think young people make their own decisions about how much a part of that, their identity, they want that to be. Some people are real advocates for telling people about it and wanting people to learn about it, and others are very private about it and actually think this is my business, nobody else's. That's absolutely not, neither is right or wrong. It's about making your own choices and having those supported. And just that journey from dependence to independence, and sometimes with a condition that doesn't always progress forward, you can go backwards and forwards a little bit, and that change from being a bit more dependent on parents particularly and then less so is a difficult one to cover. This sort of thing more, the lower ones are more actually going into sort of young adults into adult care, but sometimes those conversations start in the paediatric clinics and things about peers and career, but things like body image and sexuality, how you feel about your body with that sort of illness, particularly if you've had surgery, if you've needed to have a stoma or something like that. There can be a lot of conversations that can be had about how to think about that for yourself, but also how to share that information with who you want to speak to about it, and also some questions about fertility and pregnancy, which I don't think we've had many of in our paediatric clinic, maybe one or two. And maybe just really briefly, this is a very sort of crude idea, and maybe about how I think the whole team would actually think a bit about the complexity, really, of your kind of emotional health and physical health working together. But if you think about the life situation as being a diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease, you actually start here with altered physical feelings and symptoms, and then altered behaviour as a result of those symptoms. But you also get different emotional feelings about, having a diagnosis, about how that diagnosis is physically making you feeling, and then you might start to have altered thinking and maybe negative thoughts or difficult thoughts about, what happens to me, what about school, what about what I want to do, what about my friends. But you then start to get interactions, because how we think affects how we feel, and how we feel affects how we think, and sometimes that can get actually into a very complicated loop that needs a little bit of unpicking. And sometimes anxiety can actually cause physical symptoms, and then you kind of end up back here, but for very different reasons. So it can sometimes be about trying to unpick what's causing what. And just some little ideas. These are some quite nice sheets that I use that are just about different ways of your brain tricking you into thinking things that I think we all probably recognise as to things as being black and white or right or wrong, or sort of blaming yourself or for blaming other people. Catastrophizing, so everything gets really out of proportion. Even if something's small, it ends up being a disaster. Things always expecting the worst. So just a little idea about some of the ideas that you might start to think about at how your brain is really affecting how you're dealing with how you're feeling and how your body feels. So just kind of a bit of a pull things together. There are different groups of people that I would speak to as well as the team would speak to. Challenges for the teenagers, just about how to live with the diagnosis and who knows. How you think about sharing that information and how to be the person you want to be with the diagnosis of IBD, but also starting to be your own expert and actually representing yourself in appointments with the professionals and moving on to adult teams. Sometimes challenges for parents is actually how to let that young person start to manage their own illness and represent themselves. It can be very difficult for some parents to relinquish the very protective coating that they have around children that they've looked after for the period of time that they've been ill. Sometimes there can be some guilt involved, and the role of the illness in the family and how that gets affected as children get older. But also just, I say, general autonomy of the family and how the illness plays into that. And just for the psychologist who works with the team, I have to say I was very lucky a lot of the time. I got to make these decisions for myself. In a lot of teams, psychologists are quite restricted as to who they see, how long they see them for, but just who they can work with, whether that might be an individual young person, with a family, with siblings, and who gets to decide that. Sometimes it can be about challenging the team about what a perception of normal is for a family, or for about dealing with an illness. And also sometimes about issues about confidentiality. A lot of certainly teenagers often quite like to have a confidential conversation with psychologists in particular, but also sometimes with the team. And for parents that can be quite hard, that it's a private conversation. Sometimes for me it was about how to manage the team. If there was some difficulty going on, people get very passionate about how we look after people and wanting to do the right thing, and sometimes that meant we had to have conversations about us amongst ourselves about how to deal with things. And then just finally, what to hand over and to who. And I think I'll probably leave it there, just save a bit of time.
Thanks, Kate. That was fantastic. And you expect you can all understand why we're still missing Kate at the Royal London Hospital. She's not there now, so that was fantastic. Thanks very much. So we'll go on to the question and answer session now. I think we've got, how long? An hour, or up to an hour, maybe less if there are no questions or answers. So we've got a panel. I think the panel members know who they are, and we've got some seats up here. So you have to come and sit up on the top here, and I will introduce everyone that you don't know once they're up. So if you'd like to come up. We've got some microphones somewhere, I think, have we? So everyone think about your questions. So from the left, at the far end is Manal Patel. He's a senior paediatric dietitian at the Royal London Hospital. So any sort of dietetic question can go her direction. Then is Dr. Pratima Deb, who's a colleague of mine at the Royal London Hospital. And she's a consultant paediatric gastroenterologist there, particularly interested in microbiomes, so I'm sure there's a microbiome question floating out there somewhere. Kate, you know. Professor Holmulig, you saw on the screen earlier from Oxford. He's come down from Oxford today, so thanks very much for coming. And Marco, you also know as one of the speakers from earlier. Okay, so we've got a couple of hands up over on Graham's side. We've got some microphones, and then we'll come and find you. So,
hi there.
And Jochen snuck up. There you are.
Can I ask more than one question, or is that just...
No, one question, then we'll come back to you if it keeps going.
All right, okay. I don't know which one to pick. Okay, so if you have a nut allergy and you want to do immunotherapy, which is available to do so, I've had rejections from 2 professors for my daughter to go on the trial. But from when we saw our gastroenterologist, she said she doesn't really see why it would be a problem, even though it creates inflammation. What's your view on that? Do you think it's safe to do so, or do you think there's not enough information out there to make that kind of decision at this stage? That makes sense.
I was going to say, for the clinical trial itself, hopefully they would have some criteria. It was a complete no. That's what I suspect, just because clinical trials, you know, a lot of work goes behind the scenes to get a criteria of inclusion-exclusion. There are panels, there are expert panels that sit to decide which children are deemed safe to go into a trial. So I can understand why inflammatory bowel disease might have excluded her. It was... For everyone with the nut allergy. Yes, understood. Was that the allergy team refused her? Is that what I'm... Understood. Understood. Yes. 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 I was going to say, I'm with your gastroenterology colleague there, because it's called a multidisciplinary team in the NHS. And I would have thought that would have been a good outcome, is where you can put your heads together. So you've got the gastroenterologist. And actually, we work really closely with our allergy colleagues, because there's a lot of crossover between GI allergy and inflammatory gut diseases. So often, we work really closely with them anyway. So that route, I would have thought, would be advisable, because you've got the gastroenterologist, the allergy team, the dietitian, sitting together probably to work things out in a safe way for your daughter to then have the treatment without rocking the boat for the IBD. Do you see what I mean? And I would have thought, theoretically, I wouldn't have thought that would be an issue either, but I would have done it in a safe way. Totally. But it shouldn't preclude her from treatment for the nut allergy. So, yes, I think combined care and MDT would be a good way to get around that one.
Okay, we have a question here. Is there someone behind over there?
How far are you away from the adult drugs that are available for children? And what are they? I know you said there were like 7 that have been approved, and obviously there's only 2 for children at the moment. What are those other ones? Are they better in a way, and how far away is it? Like, will our children be adults by that point?
So it's an interesting point, because one of the slides has shown that we have formally 2 medications, adalimumab, infliximab, and there has been a delay of about 8 years in this setting. But unfortunately, there are a number of drugs that are now in adult practice. They include some of the drugs, like how immune cells move into the gut, how cytokines signaling is happening, tofacitinib, upadacitinib, these called JAK inhibitors. Then a number of drugs that block certain cytokines. And there is probably sort of a spectrum of about 12, 14 treatments that are currently in the last stage of clinical trials and are either already in the NHS setting or will come. Now, for many of those, clinical trials in pediatrics have only started. So to answer your question specifically, this is between 5 and 10 years and plus X. And currently, so if it's not visible, if this practice does not change, then it might not close the gap. So currently the data suggests it's not getting shorter. And the reason is that in pediatrics we are so much used to have safe medications. And that initially prevented sort of an immediate transition into pediatric care because we want to give only safe medications, and that requires a bit of delay from adults just to be sure. But the second is something we are used to a degree that pediatric patients are not small adults. And that sort of is driven by sort of course factors like growth, pre-pubertal changes that are very, very different to adults. And it has somehow imprinted into this approval process. So the Food and Drug Administration in the US or in Europe or in UK sort of are very aware of these differences. And what we just became clear sort of in the last sort of 3-4 years, that for the majority of patients, it's probably close enough to make this transition very, very earlier. So this initiative that has been just mentioned, sort of sponsored by the European Society and by the American Society, is now trying to re-erect this misconception and to say if there is a drug that works in adults that has undergone sort of safety measurements where efficacy has been shown, then we want to have a very short process to show in a few children that it's safe, and then sort of to have for the majority of children that are 13, 14, 15, 16 years of age to have a very, very fast transition process. And the hope would be that this would be not longer than 3 years in this process. But currently, it's 5, 10 years plus, and this is not sufficient.
Yeah, and it's probably worth saying, I mean, it used to be drug companies didn't do the work at all because they don't make much money out of the children, so they would just avoid trials, and that got stopped by various regulations in Europe, so they had to provide that. And in fact, I'm going to a meeting next week which is about exactly this, to try and speed it up it's actually in Vienna, so there are lots of moves to speed it up, but it hasn't sped up yet, and it's disappointingly slow. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, just
Sorry.
if
and then I'll have the next question over there.
If that's okay, just briefly. I suppose it's not so much at the moment also that there is completely no access to these drugs. So, often we use these drugs already. But as you can imagine, it's not really good to use these drugs off license. You kind of use them without formally having a license for these medicines. We've done a study last year where we're looking at just how these drugs are kind of used across the UK in different centers, and you can just see that people just out of desperation use it in a very different way, and that's obviously not a very good strategy. So you kind of want to have, you want to have a drug licensed, you want to know for which cohort to use it, and then to generate good data to help, patients in the future. And that is at the moment not happening, which is quite sad.
Hi. I was very interested to hear about the research. It's something as a parent I cling on to by my fingernails every time I come to one of these sessions, and I do stay abreast of research myself. And I just wanted to ask how you felt about a few papers recently have come out about the vagus nerve, and if you saw any promise for that as a less invasive treatment for children in the future for inflammatory conditions.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for your engagement with research. We appreciate any family who will be keen to support. I have read a bit about it, but I don't think we've got enough to, for me to be able to tell you whether it's going to be effective or not for IBD pain management. As you know, there's different levels of medical evidence that we need to then make a statement and to give a strength to that statement. So sometimes you have a few cases in an area or in a country that have been treated successfully with a measure or therapeutic approach. And then the level above that is an observational study when you pull these cases together and you look at them either retrospectively or prospectively. And then if you go higher than that, you have a randomized controlled trial, and then you do your systematic reviews that bring the trials together. So with what you are mentioning, we are at an early stage where there is some case reports and some initial evidence, but it is not there yet for me to, to know exactly how this is going to impact on the larger population. So normally when there is a promising case series report, then someone will perform a study, and from that study there will be further interest in making it bigger. So at the moment I'm a bit limited in telling you. I can't predict the impact, but if it is promising and interesting, I'm sure the research around it will grow further.
Hi, thank you. All has been very informative today. Quick question. A couple of guys have mentioned about the increase in IBD related illnesses. Is it safe to assume that that contribution to the increase is through environmental, or is it just, are we more aware of it and testing more?
I can start and then please jump in. We know part of the answer because it's simply not entirely known, but we definitely have evidence that the environment does play a role. What I think is very interesting is there are some studies on migrating populations. For example, say someone who was born in rural Africa, where basically we don't really see inflammatory bowel disease, but if they move to the Western world, themselves, so the offspring or the future generations will then develop inflammatory bowel disease. So same genetics, but different environmental exposure. We do have evidence that can play a role in IBD. Like we summarized, there's partial understanding in that there is or there can be a genetic background. For some types of IBD, the genetics actually explains the condition. This is some of the examples that Jochen shared with us. In what we call polygenic or classic IBD, some genes might be underlying, but then the environment on top of that also triggers or makes the condition declare itself. How it happens and the exact mechanisms are being researched into, so we know some answers, but we probably need more to be able to address this question 100%.
Quickly say one thing. Actually, the comment on awareness is obviously very, very good, because you see actually some conditions where awareness rises, and then you actually start, diagnosing these cases more than before. I would think for our population and society, I don't think that plays a very big role anymore, because I think the networks of diagnostics and how to pick these kids up, might have minor variation of how fast you probably diagnose someone, but I think the data that we've seen in terms of the incidence overall, I think we can probably safely assume this is an environmental driver that kind of pushed that number up. Is it fair to say? I think.
Agreed.
And many of these factors focus on the microbiome. So, for instance, there are environmental factors that we know really well from an epidemiological point of view. For instance, breastfeeding, certain instances of multiple antibiotics that change the microbiome over time, but also some processed food or less fiber sort of content. And they change the ecology of the microbiome in us. And we have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years to a microbiome, and that's our food, that's our sort of environment. And now with this change, it changes the balance. And some of these things are, of course, good. They are part of our culture, some hygiene, some antibiotics for severe disease that helped to reduce childhood mortality dramatically. It's a big benefit. But as a side effect, our microbiome is changing as well, and that probably explains why there is a rise in some diseases. It's not all bad. Childhood mortality is reduced by 90%. IBD is now from 1 in 1,000 to probably 1 in 100. So it's a reasonable effort, but it's still the overall benefits that we all have might still be positive, but we have to be aware, and food is probably a key factor.
Hello. Perhaps a follow-up question to the microbiota that you've been discussing. And thank you. It's great to be able to get inputs from this panel. My child has been diagnosed with IBD about a year back through multiple combinations of diagnosis, non-diagnosis. So she finally has Crohn's. My question was mainly in regards to dysbiosis testing. My child has gone through several rounds of antibiotics, which potentially might have altered a microbiota in some sense. So I just wondered, in routine care in NHS, do we do this? Do we do dysbiosis testing? Is it worthwhile? Is it something which, I'm not too aware to ask the right question, perhaps, but I would like to get your inputs on this.
Shall I start? It's a really valid question, and certainly something I think we're probably all aware of is more and more of our patients are getting these tests done privately. It's not available on the NHS, I don't think, in the entire UK, so no, it's not got any clinical interpretation value for us to be able to diagnose one's microbiota, and that's simply because the microbiota is dynamic. It's constantly changing. Certainly things like antibiotics will change your microbiota vastly, and then it needs to restabilize and come back to where it was, which it can do after antibiotic courses. But what nobody really knows is what is the good bacteria that equates to then good health, and what is the bad bacteria that equates to then disease. We've got a fair idea. We sort of know the kind of combinations of good bacteria and the kind of ones that we think are related to inflammatory bowel disease, but no one really knows what the bacteria are doing. They know which ones are there in say, a patient with IBD, but they don't know what that bacteria actually does, what the function is. So in the NHS currently, testing for the trillions of bacteria that live in one's large bowel doesn't really hold any translational value. It won't tell us anything that can inform therapies. So one thing I'm quite passionate about is to sort of inform our families that having these tests done privately really have no meaning. And I genuinely feel quite strongly about this because I've seen families pay quite a lot to have these studies done. And it's, for a start, no one knows how to measure the microbiota very accurately. It's probably not best done on a stool sample taken on one particular day. How it's stored, no one really knows. If it's left overnight and then taken to the lab, or if it's frozen straight away or put in someone's fridge, which has also happened. So, it changes, and these measurements are dynamic. So to sort of say that, you've got these bacteria, and that might mean that there's some therapeutic value or some interpretable value, I don't think is correct. And that's potentially why in the NHS we don't test for it, because we just simply cannot interpret it. Now, research-wise, we certainly test for it, so certainly it's one of the things I investigate is we know that children with IBD, in fact even adults with IBD, have a very different composition of gut bacteria to healthy individuals. So we know that. So that's where the environment comes in, because we know our gut bacteria changes in response to the environment, particularly in response to diet. Certainly with Crohn's disease, one of our therapies is the liquid diet for 6 weeks that Simone, you told us about for twice over. Now we know that changes the gut bacteria. So this is where the research really is at, is where we're trying to investigate that gut bacteria, but not just knowing who they are, but actually what they do. And that's more tricky, because that involves some really sophisticated scientific techniques that we're still learning about. But in answer to your question of whether it's useful to just test a static microbiota profile, I don't think it is.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was going to ask about the treatment for IBD. So hardly do I hear people talk about surgery, but it's an option. So is there any reason why the experts don't talk about surgery?
I can start. Do you want to start?
No, you start.
It's a very good question. Surgery is definitely there. It exists and is totally part of the options that we have to treat our patients. Of course, doing a surgery is always a big step for the child and the family for a number of reasons that are, I think, obvious to all of us in the room. But we do talk about it, and we should be talking about it. If you mean like talking about it on meetings like today, is probably a bit biased that maybe there is no pediatric surgeon in the panel just today. But if we had a pediatric surgeon, of course, they would tell you a lot about it. In terms of our clinical practice, I think it's important to always have surgery in mind at any stage of a child's journey that is relevant to the child and the family. Sometimes surgery should happen sooner rather than later, because if we try to delay it, we might actually cause lots of harm to the child's colon or bowels. Of course, we can offer different types of surgery. In ulcerative colitis, a removal of the colon will cure the disease, because of course you remove the colon, that's the part of the bowels that's affected by ulcerative colitis. In Crohn's disease, if you remove part of the bowels, Crohn's might relapse in other areas. So it's different types of surgery and different indication at different times. So it will depend on the specific situation, but if a child is really unwell with IBD, with what we call acute severe colitis, there are some treatment medical options that we can try, but we have to really try them timely, and if they're not working, we should have a low threshold to involve the surgical team and proceed. For Crohn's disease, a bit more tricky in that removing part of the bowel will not resolve the Crohn's disease, and you might relapse in other bits that remain. So we're possibly a bit more careful doing surgery in Crohn's, but it can be done. Sometimes it has to be done. And it depends. I mean, patients have Crohn's in different parts of their body. If the Crohn's is very limited, only involving a very specific area, sometimes it's easier to remove that area and join up the rest of the bowels, as opposed to shooting lots of immune suppressants or biologics to that child that only has those 10 centimeters that are really causing him trouble. So it really needs to be discussed on the individual case basis, but it should be discussed, and it's definitely something that we would not overlook or hide from.
I think one of the things we're probably guilty of is with the advent of all these newer biologics, potentially, as physicians, we try to keep the surgeons away from our patients because, we try and use the newer drugs that we know can work if it means we're delaying quite an invasive surgery, even for ulcerative colitis, for a young person to have a stoma bag. It's a big thing, and I think certainly as physicians, one of the things we want to think is that the last resort. And now, what we're now working towards, we've now realised, is surgery shouldn't be seen as a last resort. So if actually we can get to a stage where we can almost predict which children are not going to do very well on those biological treatments, that's where we want to be, because then we won't subject them to those immune suppressants, as Marco says. We would actually get our surgical colleagues to see that child very early. And one of the things we have to get is a careful balance of not trying every single drug before we then get the surgeons involved earlier. And that's evolving, and that's something that I think we're learning together with our surgeons to involve them earlier. So I think certainly we've had a few cases at the Royal London with Crohn's disease, where it is just a small part of their bowel that has been inflamed, and we've tried biological therapies, but they've not worked. And then actually the surgeon has resected that small part, and touch with these young people have stayed in remission off any treatment. So I think you're absolutely right to ask the question, and I think something we need to consider even as part of our panel is to have our surgical colleagues here who can talk about being more included in this sort of forum, because definitely surgery is a option, and it's something we all have at the back of our mind, and it's just a clinician thing because we've got the drugs, we want to try them, but it's not always the way to go.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just a bit of an observation stroke question regarding GPs as a gatekeeper and access to your services. Our experience is it's been shockingly poor in the area we were in. We were at A&E a number of times, at the GP surgery a number of times. It was approximately 1.5 to 2 years from first symptoms. Matthew was going to the toilet 20 to 30 times a day. He was referred to paediatric surgery, I think, for something else. We phoned up the GP and we were advised, stop worrying, you're worrying unduly. So Matthew ended up at A&E in a severe condition, and it seemed the whole blockage in this pipeline through, I think, multiple visits was, unfortunately, the GP. And I guess the question is, has there been any study done on time between first seeing the GP and access to your services? Does that affect long-term outcome? And is there geographical areas where there just seems a complete misinformation? And I don't know whether it was the GPs we saw, whether joined up approaches, what the issue was, but if we had followed the GP's instructions and not eventually bypassed them and just went to A&E and said, and they were eventually excellent, the doctor we saw diagnosed it straight away, but we went through so many medical professionals who was parents we trusted and were made to feel pretty stupid for questioning their diagnosis. So it was just a sort of observation stroke, research stroke, GP's long-term outcome. What's happening out there?
That's a very, I mean, you raised several important points, and of course it's heartbreaking to hear of if there is a delay, and this does happen at times, and sometimes it happens on the level of the GP, sometimes it happens in our hospitals that we're not able to make immediately the right diagnosis. I believe there is probably sort of a degree of a postcode sort of association. In general, I feel the GPs are doing probably an extremely good job because they see thousands and thousands of patients, the old ones, pediatric patients. They have to deal with all of this, and in general, they probably are extremely good gatekeepers in this system. I feel there are weaknesses in this system. The NHS is dramatically underfunded as a whole, and sometimes we, and I see really we as a system, of course we fail our patients, and this is part what society is able to deal, part what the NHS is in this setting. In general, I feel it's an excellent system for the resources provided, but there are shortcomings very, very clearly, and I see your point. Research can help, but it needs to shape policies, and that's probably sort of where the difficulty is. What is the consequence for this? Is it just teaching? Is it that we have to teach GPs better? And I feel at some stage it comes to the point that there need to be resources available in this system if we really want to improve this. I know it's not a satisfactory answer because it's a step back, but I feel in general the GPs are really, really good. We need to work together. We need to work as partners. For us in hospitals, it's often very easy to see the one patient who has been delayed, who clearly sort of should have seen easier. But I want to just to feedback in general, sort of GPs are doing quite well.
I would agree. We've had
teaching. GPs is they may not have seen a single patient with IBD ever.
Yeah.
Because it's such relatively rare. So the first time it happens to them, they're not thinking about it. It's just not in their head. Since they look after every condition under the sun, training them for that one patient is actually quite difficult. But that was the NHS initiative I was talking about earlier, all about trying to push GPs. If you see a patient, child or adult, with tummy problems, do these blood tests, do these stool tests. If they're abnormal, refer them in. And unfortunately, there are probably hundreds of these NHS sort of initiatives. So how many get through to the GPs? I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I do. And I think always the thing it goes back to, if parents are repeatedly going back about the same condition, you know, parents, very simple, parents often know best. And I think it's that thing of just mentally saying to them, if they're coming back to it, maybe I'd better ask a friend. And I think that's always the thing, parents are, with anything, not all the time, but quite a lot, know best. But
I think what's really promising is certainly we have done in our area, for our locality, we've done some GP teaching, because actually our general practitioners asked for it. So certainly I, along with some respiratory colleagues, you know, we sat and did some GP webinars. Now initially the uptake was very selective from a certain catchment of GPs. You know, 7 years later, you're now getting this massive uptake from GPs around London, which is really lovely to see. And one of the things, a bit like Nick is saying, that our take-home messages are, any child who's had persisting diarrhea or the presence of blood, do that stool test for a calprotectin. That's a very easy screening test. If it's abnormal, refer to us, and then we have a index of 2 to 3 weeks to then see that patient. So, and that's been really good. So a bit like Professor saying, we are seeing that uptake now, and largely most of our referrals are coming through via the GPs and not our general paediatric colleagues or A&E. So that's really promising. But this is what comes back to the postcode thing of which GPs have access to this kind of training and which clinicians are being able to have access to be able to have that time and support to be able to deliver that training. And this is where working together comes in, and having parents like yourself also doing that education your end to be also asking for a stool test. You know, it's that simple, but then all of us together can get that to change. Now, in terms of the second part of does that change prognosis, I'm not sure it does. We've seen a lot of cases that have been delayed presentation. The nice thing is it hasn't caused any harm to that young person, and they've been able to get treated and do well. So I don't think there's been an actual study on that, because it's so hard to quantify, does delayed presentation risk to more harm long term? But I don't think so, hopefully.
Thank you. Can I just actually maybe just from my perspective, I think that the difficulty is the damage it does as far as trusting health professionals is concerned. And I just think we've all seen, you know, understandably upset and angry parents who finally got to where they need to be and actually have just really lost confidence in their local health professionals and actually what they've done, having been dismissed when their concerns turned out to have been absolutely correct. So I think that obviously, Gemma says it's not about necessarily affecting prognosis, but I think it makes a massive difference to the parents and to the child.
I would say, yeah, we've lost a lot of confidence.
Of course. Yeah.
First line.
Okay, we have a question.
Yes. I have observed that the Royal London is working properly. But what about, and congratulations for that, but what about other hospitals? I am thinking the rural areas. Now with the integration that we have, there is any possibility that perhaps other hospitals or perhaps the Royal London will try to do something in order to promote more support, because in my case the most important thing is now, and we have here a psychologist, how is the mental health? If we are talking just only about the physical health, wow, so the mental health will be practically on the floor because there is no support with mental health in all the areas. So any comments or investigations or proposals? Thank you.
Kate, is that one for you?
Do you know, it's so difficult. I've been running family groups for CICRA for a long, long time, and it still breaks my heart, the disparity in availability. I mean, actually, availability even from a kind of gastro MDT.
Yeah, perhaps Manal could talk about dietetic support as well.
You know, dietetics, nurse specialists, all of those sorts of things. I think there are a lot of areas that just have so little still. And psychology kind of, you know, is almost like the cherry on the top, I think, as far as a lot of funding is concerned. but having said that, I mean, actually the teams provide a lot of psychological support as part of their jobs anyway. I think usually the psychologist is somebody who often deals with the more complex, more difficult situations or sort of more specific things. It's incredibly, there are so many gastroenterology teams who just cannot get funding for all sorts of posts, not just psychology, but for all sorts of posts. It's very, very difficult. And I actually think it's getting worse.
Manal, do you want to talk about
dietetic,
dietetic support generally?
Yeah, I'd agree with Kate. We try our best in terms of looking after our patients with IBD, but funding is a big issue, and we tend to firefight the conditions that our patients have rather than being proactive, being able to do that teaching and give that additional support. We're only able to see the patients when they're unwell or presenting with symptoms rather than helping them to prevent the symptoms in the first place and in the longer term.
I was going to say the only thing, and you guys know far more about this than I do, but actually I know there are paediatric centres across the country, but I think often the difficulty is, and you're saying in sort of more rural areas or outside of big cities, people often have to travel a really long way to get to their centres of specialist expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the concepts here is that while you will have an adult gastroenterology department in the vast majority of the hospitals in the UK, pediatric gastroenterology is more subspecialized, so you don't have a pediatric gastroenterologist in every hospital, but there are some, probably 12, 15, I don't know, pediatric gastroenterology centers in the UK. So, for example, I'm based in Norwich, and that will cover Norfolk, North Suffolk and other areas around it. So if a child is staying in a hospital within the area that is not us, they will not have a pediatric gastroenterologist. But this goes back to Dr. Depp's point about training and teaching. They should be able to recognize IBD and send the child timely, refer the child timely to us. When we vet these referral letters, we have a very, very low threshold to accept, because we do recognize the child could have IBD, and we will see them soon and we will prioritize their camera test. The problem is what happens until that time, which was your point. We don't see that. Like, I don't see what happens before I get to see these patients, and when I see them, it's like, how is it possible that it took 6 months for the child to be seen by me? When I'm seeing other children who haven't got IBD, they're much better, but I do see these ones in the clinic. So why did it take so long for a child with IBD to be seen by me? So there's something is problematic out there, and we don't necessarily see that part of the process. But I think with more teaching and training and involvement of our colleagues outside of pediatric gastroenterology, this is where we need to invest in, and we are trying to do it.
Okay, so question over there, and then
me.
and
I
then
hate
you.
microphones. A couple of times I've heard mention about concurrent, was that the right word? Cardiovascular disease. Have you got something reassuring to say about that? Because that's sort of news to me, and I wondered what that was. Does that make sense?
Jochen?
I don't think I fully got that. You mean cardiovascular disease as in problems with clotting or something like that, or?
Just really in passing, this this CICRA day and the previous one, someone just saying, a coexisting thing.
So
what is that?
Certainly a few sort of generic comments which hopefully would not affect the majority of our kids. So obviously, if you have someone who is in an inflammatory state in general, you would say the chance to clot easier than someone who isn't in an inflammatory state is elevated. That's something we do know. And we also know that particularly children who present to hospital with something like an acute severe colitis, for example, we recently looked at that actually at a sort of European level, but also at the UK level. Probably our threshold for making sure we kind of actively prevent clot formation in these kids is certainly much lower than it was, before, because obviously, if you have a clot in certain parts of your body, it can be very, very severe. Now, I would not think beyond that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there is any data in pediatrics that they have an increased sort of chronic cardiovascular risk of something like, I don't know, heart attacks and things like that. You know, in general, I don't think there's data for that as much as I know. But I think it's mainly about the one thing that is really relevant, particularly in acute presentation to hospital with acute colitis, being bedbound, you know, having this significant inflammatory burden, that obviously your risk of clotting goes up, and that needs to be addressed by the team. It's going to be seen. Does it answer your question?
Hi.
Some studies in adults who have looked for cardiovascular risk and, for instance, IBD, and they found associations with Crohn's disease. And this is what we call confounder, because, for instance, smoking is increasing the risk, for instance, for Crohn's disease, and of course has an impact of cardiovascular disease, some health conditions. So there are epidemiological studies, less so in pediatrics. There are extreme rare instances where there are associations within families, and then it's worth to discuss with your pediatric gastroenterologist whether there could be a genetic risk.
Hi. Lovely to see everyone today. It's so great to have so many people on the panel to ask a question to. My son was diagnosed with Crohn's 2 years ago. Dr. Deb, you're one of our doctors. So it's been great because he's on a biologic that's working. So we're in a really good place. I guess this question is to Ms. Patel and Dr. Deb as well, I guess. Just on diet, and apologies, I've missed the beginning of these sessions, so I don't know if diet was touched on. But are there studies underway looking at the impact of diet on inflammation with IBD? I know it's so varied. I see people tell me they can eat popcorn, some people can't eat popcorn. Like it's so different for everyone. But are there studies on it currently? Do you see this developing in the future, particularly for Crohn's, because my son has that? Thank you.
So there's definitely research going on for both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. In terms of Crohn's, there's a lot of evidence for EN and partial EN with exclusion diet. Outside of the initial remission phase, people are looking at the specific carbohydrate diet and the Mediterranean diet, so there is some evidence there. In terms of, there is more ongoing research into exclusion diets that is going to come out later on, but each patient is specific in terms of what their course of treatment will be and what foods are tolerated. But there's definitely some evidence for some of those specific diets, and it depends on the individual child in terms of what their growth is like and what restrictions they would be able to live with in terms of their day-to-day life and what their activities look like.
I mean, I think this is a really exciting field of research, and it's the one that I'm in because I'm looking at the gut bacteria. And one thing our patients are always asking is, can my child eat anything? You know, because actually, Dr. Deb, when he eats dairy, he's really not right, or when he has a kiwi fruit, he's definitely not right. Parents know their children, and when parents tell me these things, there's something in that. There's something in the fact that there are some foods that trigger that individual child's microbiome that is changing or reacting to then trigger their IBD. Now, one of the things, there's plenty of research. I can't name all the studies, but there are a multitude of research studies, really good quality studies, the ones that Minal has mentioned, looking at specific diets, both in Crohn's and in UC. The one I'm more interested in is in Crohn's because we know that enteral diet works and really effective. So this is where this is coming on in, because you can't keep children on liquid diets. But, you know, we've touched on the fact that IBD is increasing. We've touched on the fact that this is potentially because of environmental pathogens, one of them being modulating the gut bacteria. We know that your gut bacteria change in response to your diet. And we also know that our diets have changed radically. So, you know, gone are the days where I said to my parents that, oh yeah, your child can eat whatever they like. I now actually do consciously say, please get your child to have what is a healthy diet, a healthy, balanced diet, a bit of everything. Potentially, probably some more fiber, potentially, probably less saturated fats, because of these sort of research trials that are going on, because we know the benefit of a healthy weight, a healthy, varied diet in IBD. But that's as far as we've got at the moment. But I think it's a really exciting field. And I think more and more you're going to see more about that is dietary therapies in IBD. And I think that's something that we're all have the ability to change and modulate to stay healthy generally, not just with your IBD, but generally in terms of health.
Hello. Yeah, just really great day so far. Thank you so much. I had a question about fatigue. Seems to be kind of not talked about as much, but specifically for my daughter, I would say it's a leading symptom. So what she has is, well, she's IBDU, so she was originally diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, and then after a second endoscopy, a small amount of Crohn's was found, but she very much presents with UC, so she's a lot of trips to the toilet, blood in stool, etc., etc. And she's been through various levels of medication, starting with mesalazine, azathioprine, now she's on adalimumab. Adalimumab's made a great difference, but where I hear a lot of people talk about the remission and flare nature of IBD, my daughter has that definitely in terms of the numbers, but along the way, still, you know, moving with remission and flare, the fatigue doesn't go away. And she's basically now sort of separately been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. So she has a separate team that deals with her from a chronic fatigue perspective. But she didn't have chronic fatigue before she had IBD. And lo and behold, chronic fatigue will come first. And more often than not, the toilet symptoms will follow very shortly behind. I just wondered if there's any comment or research in the fatigue. I imagine fatigue is extremely hard to research because it's very subjective, but I just wondered if there's any comment on that.
My comment, I mean, a few years ago, I got parents and audience to say what were the biggest problems about going to school. Yeah. One that came up top was fatigue. And this really surprised people because it wasn't in any of our clinical scores that we used for assessing how bad the disease is. So there is lots of planning for research and trying to measure it better, but it doesn't. Lots of people, you know, get the fatigue, as you say, without, but not necessarily with the flares or just before the flares. They get fatigue as well. And it sounds like your daughter's one of those. So,
no, I just wanted to add fatigue. Absolutely is a symptom that's very often completely independent from your acute state, and we have this for many of our patients, as Nick was saying, it's very, very common. For us as physicians, we are very bad with fatigue, really very honest, because what we're very good at measuring stuff, so we'd make sure, you know, iron, vitamins, and all of this is really good and perfect, and then we'd go back to you and say, you know, hey, everything's fine, obviously, which it isn't. So I suppose fatigue is very researched, so it's a very hot topic at the moment, and particularly, you know, together with psychologists and sort of in a sort of MDT setting, fatigue is a very, very, you know, complex problem, and actually I have to admit it's more common than actually a solution. We are not very good at that, you know, we are not very good at it at all, I have to say.
Can I also just add to that? One of the things that I used to pick up on a lot when I was working with young people was actually their pain would go, their you know, a lot of their symptoms would have resolved, and the doctors will be saying, no, the numbers are all fine, everything's back to normal, everything's good, you're fine. And the kids would be saying, but I can't, you know, they're dragging themselves out of bed to try to go to school. They're really having difficulty, you know, getting back into school. And I used to do a lot of the sort of pacing and things with them that something like a chronic fatigue team would do, just about trying to manage that. And I think it's one of those things also, isn't it, because it's so invisible that actually it's very hard to quantify. And I think sometimes you get schools kind of saying, well, actually, why aren't they back? And then the parents will be pressured, and this whole cycle would get set up. And I think it's probably one of the things that takes the longest to go. And yet it's not something that can be measured by anything, so you can't see anything on blood tests and things that represents where it's at or anything. So I think it's really hard.
Yeah, there are very simple things that we tend to advise. For example, we always check the hemoglobin. If the child is slightly anemic, we'll encourage some iron supplementation. We sometimes say give them a multivitamin regularly because it might help, but it goes well beyond that. If you check the ECHO, European Crohn's and Colitis Organization website, they've got quite a lot of information material and ongoing research around fatigue in adults, because adults with IBD also can experience fatigue, and when it happens to children it's possibly even more challenging because of school and activities and life. So having a clinical psychologist with the team is very much a positive, because it's an holistic approach. What we can do as clinicians is probably very limited, because we just say, oh, it's in clinical remission, take some iron, take some multivitamins, and there you go. And this is not a way to resolve it. So I believe the chronic fatigue team will also put some physiotherapy in place or some holistic support around the child that we are just... Exactly, yeah, we are just not capable of... Yeah.
She was homeschooled for a year because she just couldn't get out of bed.
Yeah.
And then she's just gone back to school. And lo and behold, all the numbers have gone back up. And it's like, oh, here we go again. But we're working with school and reduced timetables and things. But yeah, it's hard.
Sorry, what was the website you mentioned? What was the website you mentioned?
ECCO, ECHO, European Crohn's and Colitis Organization. It's adult-based, but there's good information about fatigue in IBD.
Okay.
Yeah. ECCO. Yeah.
So we've got time, I think, for two quick questions before we wrap up.
All right. Yeah. Okay, this is about the long-term effect of medications. So, especially, I mean, in my example, I've got a kid with 2 chronic conditions, and they have their separate sort of medications. So, I would like to know what happens in 10 years, 20 years. My child is only 10. What is there a model of care wherein you're projecting into the future and looking at some kind of risk profiling for children or young adults or anybody who's got to live with medication for a really long period of time? So, how can I be assured that she's going to be okay 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Is there some parallel stream of research that looks at complementing clinical care? That's my question.
Prof, we're looking at you.
Can I answer that one? I'll answer this one. So one of the studies that was referred to there is a study I've been involved with where we've been asking people about severe complications, severe problems in our patients. And this is across all of Europe. It covers something like 5 million population, something like that, huge population. And so we're monitoring the most severe sort of things that might happen with things like liver failure or bone marrow failure, which fortunately are very, very, very rare, especially in children. And that's why we had to set up this big network. But one of the things people worry about are, and when you consent for some of the medications you're on, you may have included things like lymphomas, which are types of cancers, and these are the sort of things people worry about. And some of our most recent data suggests that our most recent information suggests it's much less rare. I mean, it's much more rare than it was before, and even before it was very rare. And that may be because medications generally there's a better choice of them, and they're a bit safer. Plus, we monitor them probably better than we used to do. The other thing is that if you've got active disease cooking away in the background, that may well be a risk itself anyway. So the recent data suggests, certainly for one of the complications, cancer, which is spectacularly rare. I don't want people to go away worrying about it, but it's one of the things we do consent families about. Seems to be less common. We don't know why, but we think it may be because of better treatments and monitoring things. So, Holm, go on. And then one more question there.
Yeah, I think what's increasingly, that's why it's important to do these studies in an international setting to even know are there rare side effects, what is happening, what's happening when patients are transitioned, because some of the side effects we would not see in pediatrics, because they might be indeed, as you suggest, with 10-year, 15 years, 20-year delay. overall, the lesson probably is if a patient is not well treated, the impact for the patient is much, much more severe than the potential side effect. So if you see the balance between not being treated and not having a medication, and having the medication and taking this risk, sort of is probably in many, many instances very much in favor of treating a patient. But what we increasingly know is that there are certain combinations, for instance, of medication where we have more careful, for instance, combining anti-TNF and azathioprine. So if this is happening long term, and that's why transition clinics are so important, that we align with our adult colleagues and sometimes sort of reducing sort of this risk over time, so inducing remission, having then deep remission, then taking one component of the medication out of the equation. But in general, it's important to be aware of the risk, to talk about the risk with parents and with young people, but being not treated properly is a bigger risk in many instances than having the medication.
Thank you. So we've got time for one last quick question, and then Graham will close up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. I just wanted to ask about growth. So I'm aware that IBD can delay growth. And I just wondered, my eldest daughter, who has Crohn's, is now smaller than her younger sister, which is causing all sorts of problems in our house. Is there any particular treatments that aid growth, or is it a combination of treatment and diet? What would you suggest?
I'm just thinking you're sitting right next to Professor Sanderson, who can really taught me all I know about growth in IBD. I think it's treat the IBD is our first goal, because make sure the IBD is not active. Often children don't grow if the IBD is still active. They may not be symptomatic, and that's where we've learned not to wait for a child to start being symptomatic, but to really look at their stool test, their biochemistry, their even MRI results, sometimes even a colonoscopy, to make sure that the treatment that child is on is really achieving remission. Because then the child, all intents and purposes, should be growing. And this is where Minal can comment about the dietitian, so our patients will see a dietitian to make sure their nutrient intake is enough for them. But one of the things about growth in IBD is to make sure the IBD is inactive. And something that's been really good for that has been the biologics. We know that children who have aggressive IBD and are earlier put onto these biological drugs tend to catch up their growth. But I'm going to say something if Minal agrees or not, but regardless of how much you're going to feed at the child, if the IBD is still active, the child won't grow. So one of the ways to really ensure the child's sustained growth is to treat that IBD, and often we will use the drugs that we worry about because they have some risks, but this is where, as Prof says, that you've got to treat the IBD, and the risks of not treating is a knock-on effect on their growth.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And once the child is in remission, we would then actively look at their dietary intake. Obviously, during puberty, a lot more additional calories are needed to achieve normal growth, let alone catch-up growth. So the calorie requirement is likely to be very high during that phase. So we would then supplement if needed, with milkshakes if needed, or food fortification. But as Dr. Deb said, it's really important that their disease is under control to be able to get that growth going.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Well, we'll close there. Thanks to all the panel, and thanks to all the audience for all your questions. That was great.
Yes, thank you to everyone. I would just say on the growth conversation, I totally relate. I was one of 5, and I was certainly the youngest when I had Crohn's. I was much smaller than all of my younger brothers, so I definitely know how I feel. Having said that, this is how tall I am now, so you know there is hope. So I just wanted to finish off with just a couple of comments. Firstly, the raffle, for those people that have bought raffle tickets, you will see as you go outside in where the coffee area was, there you will see all the raffle prizes with all the numbers on them, so please do check against your one. We'll have someone there, obviously, so that you can take the right prize, but please do check as you go out. Secondly, there will be a feedback form, an online feedback form going out to you over the next few days, so please do fill it in. We only learn on what to do with these events if we hear from people what's good, what's bad, etc. You know, we really don't mind what kind of feedback you provide us. Anything is useful to us to learn how to continue with these meetings. Also, I do appreciate there were a few people that still had questions, and I know that I've spoken to a few people as well. If there are any questions that you haven't been able to ask, or hadn't had, or you think of some more questions after the meeting, please do get in touch with us. You'll notice the CICRA website, there is an email address, support@cicra.org. Please do email us, and we can certainly try and help to get details and get some responses for you. And then just finally, just a bit of a promotion. So we are continuing, CICRA are going to continue to do some family days. Now that we've started them up post-COVID, we're looking to do several next year across the country. So please do look out for them. For those people that are signed up to our newsletter, signed up to our emails, then you'll get that automatically. But also, please do regularly check our website. We do tend to, as I say, try and cover the whole country. For our family days, these, for those people that haven't been to them, we tend to extend those so they're a little bit longer than we've had today, and therefore hopefully would have a few more ability to have a few more questions. And then finally, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone. Thank you for you all to coming in. Thank you for the children for being duly occupied, I think, given all the various balloons and things that I've seen coming in over the last 20 minutes. They've obviously been very, very popular. So thank you all for coming and taking your time on a Saturday. Really appreciate it. And again, I really would like to thank all of the medical community who've given up their time to be here today. Without them, obviously, we just couldn't do those family days. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a good journey home. Thank you.